When the attackers stopped firing and you could hear magazines clicking into place, Tony Stark exploded out from behind the marble counter like a man possessed. One hand on the pistol, he started tearing into the squad, flooding the villa. Henry wanted to stay down and play dead. Then a main character superhero charged into open fire. Hiding wasn't an option anymore. This was a chance to earn a favor from someone whose last name would one day read like a company logo. Also, if Tony died here, who knew what Old Man Stark would do in revenge? Rich people might skate. Henry had neither money nor pull. He'd be the one running forever. That math took half a second. As Tony surged forward, Henry rose with him. Every time Stark squeezed the trigger, Henry checked the trajectory. If Tony's shot would land, Henry shifted targets. If it wouldn't, Henry finished it. Impossible? Not with Kryptonian-grade reflexes and processing speed. For Henry, it felt like breathing. He flipped the mental switch. Focus sharpened. Thoughts sped up. His body flowed. To anyone watching, it looked like bullet time. To Henry, the world just slowed down. He'd used the same edge on stunt sets to do suicidal gags. This wasn't luck. It was trained. Shooting people with that advantage was easy. Not getting shot was even easier. Sure, he could have gone full Kryptonian and tanked rounds, then punch heads off. That would blow his cover in seconds. Subtlety mattered. The cheat stayed under a layer of acting. Clark Kent isn't Superman because of the glasses. The clumsy routine is part of the mask. If Superman had gone to film school, he'd have a shelf of Oscars. Henry understood that now. So while Tony emptied his mag with flair, Henry fired a lazy shot or two behind him, selling amateur hour. He even timed it so he ran dry, right on cue, letting Tony think he carried the fight. Between them, 6 armed men hit the floor. Not all dead, but all done. Tony threw Henry a smug glance, confident he'd done the heavy lifting. To be fair, 4 hits with 2 clean criticals would impress most range rats. Henry popped his slide, showed he was empty, and moved to secure the down shooters. No executions, just disarms. Insurance against the classic surprise, I'm still breathing. He grabbed a pistol off the floor and tried to figure out the mag release. Tony walked over. Deadpan, what are you doing? Checking ammo, Henry said. Tony tapped the button. Press here. Henry pressed. The magazine shot out. He fumbled, barely caught it. Reloading took 2 tries. Racking the slide wasn't pretty either. He squared up at last. You left the safety on, Tony said, rolling his eyes. Oh, Henry found the switch. At least it was labeled. Tony stared. Ever used a gun before? Henry hesitated. Today's my first time. True enough. Before reincarnating, guns were TV props. Even in Alaska, he never touched John's shotgun. Tony's face darkened. He turned away, recalculating his life choices. If Henry couldn't at least draw fire, Tony would have ditched him already. Instead, Tony pocketed another pistol, slung a recovered rifle, checked the weight by feel, and kept it. He didn't hand Henry a rifle. Too new, too complex. Also bad indoors for a rookie. He finished by cracking the conscious enemies on the head with the rifle, but not gentle. Effective. Tony scanned the room, listening for more gunfire. He wasn't planning to wait for help. They're not here for you, Henry said. They want a guy named Josh Hilton. You said backup is 20 minutes out. Why risk your neck? Tony met his eyes. How do you know they won't kill everyone to erase witnesses? If we don't hit back now, once they own this villa, we're lambs for the slaughter. Look at their kit. You think anyone else can hold 20 minutes? He paused. If you're scared, sit this one out. Henry, the Kryptonian, had nothing to say. To become a true superhero, one indispensable quality is the courage to step forward. That was precisely why, even with his Kryptonian abilities, Henry never considered himself another Superman. Because when danger struck, his first instinct was always self-preservation. Sure, ever since crossing over to this world, he'd spent nearly 20 years like a blank slate, caged or suffering. But before that, he'd lived for 30, maybe 40 years in his original life. The fire of youthful idealism? Long gone. But Tony Stark, he truly was someone destined to become a superhero. Some might dismiss him as just a rich guy hiding in a metal suit. But they often forget that his first armor was forged in captivity, surrounded by enemies, built from scraps purely to survive. And even when his Mark 42 was still charging, he had no hesitation breaking into enemy territory with nothing but improvised hardware from a hardware store. The Iron Man suit was a symbol of his wealth and genius, but not his bravery. That came from within. Honestly, though, Henry thought the teenage Tony Stark was just reckless. The kind of reckless that only came from youth and inexperience. It was like he was desperately trying to prove something, throwing his life on the line far too easily. And now, as this young man once again dashed toward the densest cluster of gunfire, Henry seriously considered shooting him in the leg just to make him stop. But in the end, he followed. Someone had to watch the idiot's back. With all his Kryptonian senses fully active, Henry was like a walking radar dish, tracking every potential enemy around them through walls and doors. And that's when he noticed something off. There was no doubt the attackers had a target, and that the target was here at the party. But for a force this large, their coordination was surprisingly poor. It felt less like a disciplined strike team, and more like a bunch of armed freelancers playing soldier. The evidence? Their encirclement was full of holes. If someone picked the right direction and sprinted hard enough, escape was possible. Even their room-to-room sweeps were sloppy, more focused on not stepping on each other's toes than on efficiency. That reminded Henry of something. While looting extra pistols from fallen attackers earlier, he'd also found a gold coin. It looked eerily similar to the ones he'd seen with Tom, the shady fixer from Alaska. Tom, who had ties to the underworld. And if memory served him right, wasn't that coin associated with the Continental Hotel, the secret international assassin network, where gold coins served as a universal currency and bounty contracts were fair game to any number of killers? As long as you brought proof of the kill, the full reward was yours. Whether you shared it or stabbed your partners in the back was your own call. Everything outside of Continental grounds was fair game. Inside the hotel, killing was strictly forbidden. If this was a Continental contract, then the only upside was that the quality of their assassins was all over the place. Not everyone was John Wick, a.k.a. Baba Yaga. Case in point, the goons they'd already run into. Those two at the entrance? They'd gotten so close, yet still casually took their gun off target. Any real pro would have never made such a mistake. Same with the 6 guys who stormed the foyer. They'd burned through entire magazines at the same time, creating a perfect window for Tony to counterattack. These guys might have the guts to kill, but clearly lacked the experience. If they'd been just a little more competent, Tony wouldn't have stood a chance. Henry could only hope the rest of them were just as sloppy. Just then, a shadow moved past an unlit window. Bang! Henry fired a single shot toward it. What the fuck? Tony instinctively hugged the wall and hissed back. Henry replied casually, I thought I saw something move. Maybe I was wrong. Nothing happened. In truth, someone had just been climbing in through the window. Henry's shot had nailed the guy's hand, sending him tumbling to the ground outside. Alive, but definitely out of the fight. Tony grumbled, Watch it. Don't give away our position. Yes, sir. Tony had just taken 2 steps forward when Henry grabbed the collar of his jacket and yanked him backwards, hard. Rat-a-tat-tat. Bullets shredded the air right where Tony had been standing. If Henry hadn't pulled him back, he'd have been Swiss cheese. The two of them hit the floor hard, just as the wall above them was torn apart by a wave of gunfire. The decorative wood paneling didn't offer much resistance. Tony rolled aside, making sure he wasn't crushing Henry. What the hell room is that? He asked. Smoking lounge. Tony sniffed the air. Doesn't smell like cigarettes. Henry deadpanned. You know, the kind of smoke that hits real hard. The addictive kind. Tony raised his brows, understanding immediately. He didn't comment further. Instead, he twisted around, lying flat on his back, and barked, Push me in. Henry understood. He grabbed Tony by both ankles and shoved him forward across the floor like a human battering ram. Tony's rifle peeked out from the doorway. Rat-a-tat-a-tat. The shots rang out. Then silence. Just as Tony began to rise, another shooter, hidden behind a couch, popped up. Bang! Bang! Henry, who had already moved in behind Tony, fired 2 clean shots. The first one did the job. The second was just for show. Tony shifted from line to a crouch. Though he didn't say thanks, at least he didn't insult Henry again. He stood and swept the room quickly. Half the people were high out of their minds. The other half already had holes in their heads. Gunfire echoed elsewhere in the house. Tony didn't waste a second. He bolted toward the next fight. Henry trailed behind with a sigh. So this is the difference between a hero and a couch potato. Huh?
Hey everyone, Firescale Audiobooks here. If there's a novel you'd love to hear more of, you can support us on Patreon or Ko-fi. Depending on your tier, I'll make extra parts just for the stories you're most excited about. Usually I can only upload 4 to 5 parts of each novel, but with your support, we can go beyond that. And of course, don't forget to hit subscribe. It helps more than you know.
Tony Stark, full of fire and fury, surged forward like a man possessed, like some kind of gun god. He advanced with textbook tactics, gunning down anyone armed in his path. Shot after shot, it looked like he never missed. In truth, it was Henry covering from behind, silently cleaning up any of Tony's missed shots or dropping enemies the young Stark didn't fully down. And if Tony's rifle ran low, Henry would quietly land the kill shots. Strangely enough, the attackers hadn't gone on a killing spree. Most of the guests and staff had been herded into corners like quails, made to squat down and keep quiet. Most of the earlier gunfire had been more warning shots than outright executions. Only a few out-of-their-minds partygoers, likely high as hell, had tried to resist, and they were swiftly put down. In contrast, Tony and Henry were the real killers here. Henry's shots were clean and non-lethal if possible. As long as emergency care was prompt, his targets would live and even walk again. Tony's aim? Less merciful. Some bullets found skulls. Others tore through torsos and left survivors wheezing on the ground. Thankfully, Tony didn't have the habit of finishing people off. His priority was neutralizing threats, not body count. Eventually, they cleared the entire first floor together. Anyone left breathing, Tony warned them, Stark security will be here soon. Stay hidden, stay low. Help is coming. Still, a few bold ones grabbed fallen weapons and bolted for the exits. Couldn't blame them. No one wanted to be caught in a full-blown shootout, even if Tony Stark himself was leading the charge. Henry couldn't stop Tony from running into danger, and Tony couldn't command strangers to stay put. In this chaos, everyone looked out for their own hide. Stark just wasn't that kind of figure yet. He wasn't the symbol of hope or leadership he'd become someday. At best, he was just another rich brat with a gun. The next decision, move upstairs or face the chaos at the poolside, wasn't really a decision at all. Tony had already crept toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and peeked outside. What he saw at the pool made the choice for him. 2 groups of gunmen were controlling the crowd, one from the front, one from the back. Even the floating girls in the pool had been hauled out and herded to the side. Guests, escorts, staff, all squatting in fear, herded like cattle. One group of shooters was shouting, interrogating the crowd, waving weapons. Tony, now with only a pistol after discarding his empty rifle, asked, "You think you can handle one of those groups?" Henry pulled the magazine from his gun, checked it, then slid it back in. 2 rounds left. That said it all. Tony didn't say a word. He already knew better than to expect much from his backup. Instead, he tried to think of a way to take down the gunmen without harming the hostages. But he didn't get the chance. Either the sound of their voices or the faint clack of Henry reloading had tipped someone off. One group of gunmen turned toward the house and opened fire through the windows. To make things worse, a 3rd group of shooters suddenly joined in, flooding the poolside like an unstoppable tide. Shit just hit the fan. Tony didn't even blink. He charged through the shattered glass, gun blazing at the closest group. The sudden ambush startled all 3 shooter teams. The one closest panicked and split up, ducking behind cover as they returned fire. The other 2 teams raised their weapons and opened up. Tony's lucky shot dropped one man mid-run. The other 2, Henry took care of them. Together, the 2 scrambled behind a short planter box, barely large enough to shelter them both. Bullets pinged and ripped across the planter's surface. Even the future Iron Man had to curl up tight, and Henry did the same, placing himself closer to the danger, making sure Tony didn't catch any stray rounds. Tony checked his magazine, empty. Only one round left in the chamber. "You got ammo?" he asked. Henry held up his pistol, slide locked open. "Empty." Tony growled, "Fuck." Across the pool, gunfire finally stopped. Sirens could be heard in the distance. Police or private security, hard to tell. The shooters were getting nervous. "Damn it," one shouted. "Anyone find a target yet?" Another barked at the hostages. "Where's Josh Hilton? Anyone seen him? Don't think those two idiots who charged and can save you. They're screwed too, you hear me? Screwed." The third group, the newcomers, had a calmer tone. "Doesn't anyone even know what the target looks like? Fuck you. If we did, you think we'd be out here playing 20 questions?" One of them fired a shot into the crowd. Screams exploded. The newcomer shook his head. "Easy. No need to scare them. At least they're loyal." "That's admirable. What the hell are you talking about?" Another gunshot, followed by a scream so sharp it could only belong to one man. Henry winced. He recognized that pig-like squeal. It was the chubby jerk from earlier. Of course. Then came the voice of a shooter, clear, cold, leader-like. "Josh Hilton, you've got some loyal friends. But unfortunately, that's not enough." "Why?" That was Hilton again, his voice rising like a pig at the slaughterhouse. "You're lucky," said the gunman. "The client gave explicit orders. We had to tell you why before killing you. You're going to kill me? You really think we brought all these people just to put a bullet in your ass and walk away? Please, I'm begging you. Spare me. Begging me won't help. You've said too much. Too many people know. Our employer doesn't like losing control. You know that. I'll shut up. I won't say a word again. Please, just this once. You're begging the wrong man, Hilton. We're not here to forgive. We're here to kill. Take my advice. Pray to God." "Wait," Tony shouted, suddenly rising from behind cover. But Henry yanked him down again hard. Bang, bang. 2 bullets flew just over their heads. Clearly, the gunman had been waiting for them to pop up. A third shot rang out. Hilton's screams fell silent. The effectiveness of their suppressive fire and coordinated movement left no doubt. The third group of gunmen was nothing like the amateur cannon fodder they'd faced earlier. These guys were pros. Tony wanted to stop them. But crouching behind the stone planter, he was clearly pinned down by a few well-placed warning shots. If Henry hadn't yanked him back earlier, he'd already be sporting a new hole somewhere important. The lead gunman shouted, "Target eliminated. Time to go. If we stick around any longer, the cops will be here. You really want to deal with the LAPD?" One of the jumpier gunmen panicked. "What about the witnesses? You want to shut them up for good?" "Don't be an idiot," the leader snapped. "Our employer chose this kind of scene specifically to make an example. To send a message. If you kill everyone, who the hell's left to get the message? And you know the risks here. Any one of these rich kids dies, and will be the ones on every damn bounty board tomorrow. You kill everyone, we might not even live to see tomorrow. So we're just walking away. They're not stupid. They know what they can and can't say. And if they don't, their daddies sure as hell do. If you want to stay here and worry about it, go ahead. I'm out. What about proof of the kill, huh? My guys help hold this side down. We want to cut. Once our client sees the news, they'll know the job's done. You want to share? Make sure your guys live to claim it at the hotel. Your real problem ain't me. It's the people heading this way right now. The sirens, those blaring LAPD sirens, suddenly cut out. They'd arrived. 2 of the gunman groups fired synchronized bursts into the air. 3 shots each, sharp and deliberate. Clearly a signal to regroup. Then the leader raised his voice, calling toward the flower bed. "Hey, you 2 heroes back there, we're leaving. As long as you don't pop up and try something stupid, we'll all walk away peacefully." "Cool." The son of a... Tony started to rise again, face twisted with fury. Henry yanked him down again. 2 more bullets zipped overhead. Tony cursed through clenched teeth. Realizing for the second time that he was not bulletproof, Tony Stark finally chose the smarter option. He stayed down. Moments later, voices rang out loud and clear. "LAPD, drop your weapons. Hands in the air." Henry had already ditched his empty pistol and raised his hands high. Tony did the same, casually tossing his sidearm and raising his hands halfway. "I'm Tony Stark," he announced. "I'm a victim here. I won't be answering any questions until my attorney is present. With the air of Stark Industries front and center, Henry didn't face any serious trouble. He just had to wait on the scene until Tony's legal team showed up. Besides, the police, ambulances, and even FBI agents began arriving shortly afterward. But by far the largest response came from Stark Industries' private security team. They just didn't have arrest authority. After all, everyone involved in this incident was either rich, famous, or otherwise problematic. And the line between victim and perpetrator wasn't exactly clear-cut yet. The LAPD officers, for all their street smarts, still looked out of their depth. Dealing with celebrities? That was one thing. Dealing with rich people's kids? That was another beast entirely. Because here's the deal. Celebs worry about reputation, endorsements, press coverage. Rich kids don't give a damn. They've got lawyers and power backing every move. And in this town, when a pop star gets in trouble, it's a PR bonanza. Tribute albums, memorial concerts, re-released classic films. It's a whole business model. Someone dies? That's a marketing opportunity. But if rich nobodies from powerful families start getting killed at high-end parties, that's political dynamite. So when the FBI stepped in, the head of the local precinct practically threw the case into their lap. The feds were better equipped for this level of mess anyway. Ironically, things got easier for Tony Stark the higher up the investigation went. FBI agents knew how to deal with this social tier. Beat cops? Not so much. So Henry and Tony found themselves sitting together at the back of an ambulance, protected by Stark security personnel, while a big paramedic fussed over them, checking for injuries. The two young men sat quietly, watching as cops and federal agents scrambled around the crime scene. EMTs rushed to treat the wounded, while the dead remained where they fell, awaiting forensic teams for documentation before removal. No one dared question Tony. He'd made it clear, no talking without his lawyer. LAPD didn't want that kind of trouble. Instead, the officers turned to the event staff. The party girls and catering crew didn't have lawyers on speed dial, so they got grilled first. It was all about figuring out what had happened and who actually mattered. Compared to Tony, who sat calm and composed like he was at brunch, Henry looked like absolute hell. His suit was soaked from the pool incident. He'd been running around all night, clothes wrinkled, shoes scuffed, hair mess. If Tony was the picture of wealthy elegance, Henry looked like he'd just been mugged by a sprinkler system. Then Tony turned, looked Henry up and down, and asked, "Why'd you help me?" Henry blinked. "What?" Tony elaborated. "Most of those people we saved bolted the second they had the chance. You stuck around. Didn't do much, but you stayed. This is the third time we've run into each other, isn't it?" "Didn't do much?" Henry internally screamed. "Excuse me? If it weren't for me covering your shiny billionaire ass, you'd be looking like a piece of Swiss cheese right now." Before Henry could voice his rage, Tony threw out another question. "Oh, right. Aren't you supposed to still be filming that movie? I thought it wasn't done shooting yet." Henry gave an awkward expression and said bluntly, "The producer fired me. Wanted to avoid any further conflict between us." Tony asked directly, "So, do you want me to help get her job back? Or maybe introduce you to something else? And just so we're clear, I'm not doing this because I feel obligated." "I know. And no need." Henry shook his head. This was just everyone being cautious and making decisions for themselves. Even if you hadn't said anything, they'd still have made the same call after tonight. Same logic applies here. Because I helped you, as long as you don't go out of your way to blacklist me, people will naturally figure out what to do. Even if they don't hand me new opportunities, at least they won't actively block me. That's all I need. That's all. Tony looked puzzled. "That's the only reason you helped me?" Henry scoffed. "Come on, Mr. Stark. Use that genius brain of yours. Maybe you couldn't tell at first, but looking back now, were we ever actually in danger? Their target was that fat bastard, Josh Hilton. As long as everyone else complied and didn't resist, nobody was ever going to get hurt. You could say you acted to save people, but in the end, they still got to their target. You didn't save the guy, did you? So your intervention just ended up with you shooting a few people, some of whom might have died. That's what you wanted? Tired of shooting inanimate targets and couldn't pass up the chance to try live ones." He went on, "So yeah, Helping you wasn't some noble act. It was low risk from the start. All that life-threatening danger you felt was self-inflicted. You brought it on yourself. And I didn't help you because I thought you could get me my job back. My goal became making sure you didn't get yourself killed, because if you had gotten shot tonight, the fallout would have been massive. Tony bristled. How can anyone know that in advance? In the beginning, you couldn't guarantee those gunmen wouldn't hurt bystanders, right? Henry nodded honestly. Tony continued. Then someone had to step up. Couldn't just let the bad guys do whatever they wanted. So why shouldn't that someone be me? And as for the fallout, come on, do I even have that much influence? Tisich, classic Stark air, Henry muttered. It was like people born on Earth taking oxygen for granted, never realizing how precious it was until it was gone. Talking to this guy about privilege felt just as pointless. The same way, arguing with this trust fund kid just made Henry painfully aware of his own poverty, not just in money, but in every possible aspect. Once Henry realized that, he lost interest in continuing the conversation. Yep, best to stay far away from main characters like this, lest he gets sucked into their disaster-prone gravitational fields. Even if Iron Man wasn't cursed by fate, he was definitely a magnet for trouble, or worse, someone who created it. Henry stood up and glanced around, looking for a cop or FBI agent. Time to give his statement and go home. The sooner he left this walking catastrophe behind, the better. Tony noticed and asked, "Where are you going?" "Turning myself in. Do whatever they want with me. You're not going to wait for my lawyer to get here. I'll represent myself. The law's written in books, right? A quick skim should be enough." It was an insanely cocky thing to say, but coming from Henry, it didn't even sound that crazy. Tony wasn't offended either, probably because he felt the same way. He usually let his lawyers handle things just because he didn't want to read. But what did bother Tony was how desperately Henry seemed to want to get away from him, like he was some kind of plague. Luckily, Tony had an excellent memory. Maybe he didn't care about a lot of things, but he sure remembered details when it mattered. "If I invited you to another party, would you go?" he asked suddenly. "No thanks," Henry replied immediately. "Pretty sure I've developed an allergy to rich people parties. A few more of these, and I'll end up in a body bag." "Seriously, are you sure you're not part Russian? You act like you downed a bottle of vodka and shouted Yura before showing up." Tony actually didn't take offense. He just said, "It's not one of those parties. Just a small dinner. A gathering hosted by a relative of mine." "Then I definitely don't belong there. You think I'm going to show up and do party tricks? Or maybe serve as the token poor guy so everyone can feel grateful for their trust funds?" Henry said, walking away. Tony pulled an exaggerated pout. "A shame. Miss Hepburn's dinners aren't something just anyone gets invited to. Then again, what would I bring you for? You don't know anyone there. You wouldn't fit in." Henry stopped, then turned back around. With a dramatic shift in tone, he approached and bowed slightly, face full of humble sincerity. "Mr. Stark, I believe there's been a misunderstanding between us. If I've done anything to offend you, please accept my deepest apologies. Your lawyer should be arriving soon, right? I can give them a full rundown on tonight's events. You'd only need to add a few details yourself. Save you some breath." He wasn't done. "Of course, I'll emphasize your bravery, the heroic conduct, your noble character. As the heir to Stark Industries, you risked your life to save so many people. A true role model for American youth. And hey, we're in Hollywood. Maybe we should get this story on the big screen. Let the world see your perfect aim, your fearless courage. A movie deal might not be a bad idea." He went on, voice dripping with faux reverence. "If the whole body count thing hurts your image, we could say I did the shooting. You, using your genius intellect, provided expert tactical guidance that saved my life countless times. Without your command, I'd have died for sure." The barrage of flattery left Tony speechless. He stared, visibly disturbed, at this shape-shifting Kryptonian. "Was that a bit much?" Henry asked with a sheepish grin. "Bit much?" Tony backed away a few steps. "That was like 10 different personalities at once. Are you schizophrenic?" Henry grinned wider. "It's still me, sir, your most loyal friend. Or if that's too much, your most loyal servant." He nearly lunged forward to hug Tony's thigh. Tony cursed. For God's sake, Talk like a normal person. And don't call me Mr. Stark. That reminds me of the old man. Call me Tony. Then maybe I'll think about bringing you to Hepburn's dinner." Walking behind Tony Stark, who wore a tailored suit, collar unbuttoned, no tie or bow tie in sight, Henry was extremely glad he'd given up on the waterlogged suit he'd once bought. Instead, he had wisely chosen to rent a new one for the occasion. Though he couldn't yet distinguish the difference between custom-made and bargain-bin suits, at least he didn't look out of place. In his hands, he carried a bouquet of yellow roses and lilies, a traditional American courtesy when visiting someone for the first time. Of course, a small gift or a bottle of wine would also have been acceptable. But considering the host's wealth, Henry figured anything he could afford probably wouldn't leave much of an impression. So he went with the flowers. From the moment he showed up with the bouquet, Tony Stark had been smirking nonstop. That sleazy grin made Henry's Kryptonian fists itch. He had to summon all his willpower to suppress the urge to slug the future Iron Man right in his smug face. Instead, Henry forced a warm, polite smile onto his face using 120% of his Oscar-worthy acting ability. The effect was chilling. Tony actually shivered. The dinner was being held at one of the Stark family's estates in Beverly Hills. Tony didn't live there, so the two of them had come from another location. During the drive, Henry nervously asked, "So why is Miss Hepburn staying at your family's villa?" "I told you," Tony replied. "She usually lives in Connecticut now that she's retired. But when she visits L.A., she either stays at a hotel or borrows our place for small get-togethers. Sometimes she even stays here. So, your family and Miss Hepburn are that close." Henry muttered, a dawning expression of realization creeping across his face. "Oh, I get it. Could it be that?" "Shut up," Tony snapped. "Whatever you're thinking, it's probably incredibly inappropriate. You say one more word, I'll throw you out of the car." Tony Stark clearly didn't want to discuss the past romances of the older generation. Henry, on the other hand, couldn't help wondering, was Howard Stark really that wild back in the day? Were there any Golden Age starlets he didn't hook up with? The Stark estate in Beverly Hills was just as luxurious as the villa Henry had seen during that earlier event. Only this place had more of an old-world mansion feel to it, like something left over from the last century. Honestly, Henry had no idea whose aesthetic that was supposed to reflect. As they pulled up to the wrought iron gates, Tony simply rolled down the window and said, "It's me," into the intercom. And just like that, Henry witnessed firsthand what it meant to be someone who could literally get past security with nothing but their face. The gate swung open automatically. With a rev of the engine, Tony's obnoxiously red Ferrari sped up the driveway. Henry had to admit, sports cars were all flash and no comfort. Given the choice, he'd much rather ride around in that beat-up, second-hand Cadillac he'd picked up in Alaska. But he didn't have time to worry about his sore backside. The only thing occupying his mind now was the overwhelming anxiety of meeting his idol. The moment he stepped out of the car, Henry instinctively used his free hand to smooth out the wrinkles in his rental suit. "They're here," a woman's voice called from behind the grand entrance. Henry's nerves skyrocketed. His heart pounded like a drum. As the door opened, he immediately bowed his head and extended the bouquet. "Miss Hepburn, it's an honor. I'm a huge fan of yours." "Oh, really now?" The voice wasn't quite what he expected. It was sharper, more assertive. He'd imagined something softer and huskier. Henry finally looked up, only to be greeted by the sharp, elegant face of an aging beauty, her features striking and her gaze piercing. "Oh, this Miss Hepburn." The disappointment in his voice was unmistakable. Katharine Hepburn narrowed her eyes and said coolly, "You want to try making that disappointed face even more obvious? I'll make sure not to miss your nose when I punch it." Realizing his blunder, Henry immediately tried to recover. "Ah, Miss Hepburn, please forgive my rudeness. I really am a fan. Your Oscar-winning role in Morning Glory was unforgettable. Bringing Up Baby and Holiday are two of my favorites. And of course your later works, The African Queen, Summertime, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, left lasting impressions. You're a brilliant actress with both beauty and unmatched talent." Peeking out from behind the bouquet, Katharine looked past Henry to the familiar young man behind him. Little Tony, care to explain who this smooth talker is? He's just a small-time actor in Hollywood, Tony replied. Hum. Her tone made it clear she wasn't buying that for a second. He's got a bit of street smarts. Hum. Her voice rose slightly. If someone from the Stark family said someone had a bit of cleverness, that meant they were dangerously sharp. You remember that shooting incident from a while back that made headlines? He's the guy who helped me take down those assassins. Catherine's eyebrow arched. She gave Henry another good look. Henry gave a polite nod. Henry Brown. An honor to meet you, Miss Hepburn. Call me Catherine, kid, she said with a sly smile. Otherwise, I'm afraid you'll start confusing me with the other Miss Hepburn. Henry chuckled. Yes, ma'am. Come in. Tony, this is your house. Nope, Tony replied immediately. It's the old man's. Nothing to do with me. Umph. Typical Stark man, Catherine scoffed as she stepped aside to let them in. Henry politely took her place at the door, holding it open until it closed automatically. Catherine smiled and said, If little Tony doesn't want to come in, let him stay outside and cool off. Come on, kid. Yes, ma'am. Henry trotted after her cheerfully, leaving the sulking heir to Stark Industries behind. Hey, Catherine, I'm your friend. And since when do friends have an obligation to babysit children? She shot back. Tony grumbled as he opened the door himself. I'm the one who arranged for today's chef, by the way. Well, you can always send them home, Catherine said airily. Gives me a chance to show off my culinary skills. Henry chimed in, I've got some experience in the kitchen too. Happy to help. Oh, how wonderful, Catherine beamed. Well, it seems we've already figured out who the most useless person here is, haven't we? In the end, no one cooked. They left that to the professional French culinary team. And since it was a proper dinner gathering, naturally the attendees weren't limited to just Henry, Tony, and Ms. Catherine Hepburn. Also present was a high-profile couple from the financial world, Alex Hart, the CEO of MasterCard, and his wife. Perhaps because Henry was clearly an outsider, Mr. Hart didn't try to dominate the conversation with financial jargon. Instead, he fulfilled the role of an ideal guest, offering timely and thoughtful reactions. But much to Tony Stark's frustration, who typically enjoyed being the center of attention, this evening he was completely overshadowed by Henry. Henry could name nearly every one of Catherine's films off the top of his head. He even quoted contemporary positive reviews. Not only that, he could analyze each film's strengths and weaknesses with insight and nuance. To someone unfamiliar with film, the conversation might have sounded like total nonsense. But Catherine Hepburn? She wasn't some actress who never watched her own performances. Born from theater, she was one of the rare Golden Age actresses who truly studied the craft, not just relying on natural charisma. So naturally, she understood everything Henry was saying. And this connection clearly stirred something in her, a sense of encountering a kindred spirit. Catherine said, So when you said you were my fan, and not just of that other Miss Hepburn, you weren't lying after all. Ms. Henry began. Call me Catherine, she said warmly, smiling. All right, Catherine. I wouldn't dare lie to such a talented and beautiful lady like yourself. If I were just making it up, I bet you'd see right through me. From the side, Tony muttered, What a damn suck-up. Everyone heard it, but no one paid it any mind. They just chuckled and continued talking. It was clear they were all quite used to Tony Stark's personality. Catherine added, Well then, Henry, let me quiz you. Please go ahead. Critics often accuse me of dragging out my career, saying that after 40, I've only managed to cling to the box office with nostalgia. What's your take on that? Take their words for what they are, Catherine. Bullshit, Henry said without hesitation. There are many reasons why a film might underperform at the box office. But in my opinion, the fault lies mostly with the Hollywood system. Oh, that's a fresh answer. Finally, someone who doesn't just blame the audience for lacking taste, Catherine said. Henry continued with sharp criticism. Hollywood defines female roles in the narrowest of ways. You're either a pretty young girl, a sultry mature woman, or a bitter old hag. That's it. But women are far more complex than that. Studios use box office numbers to justify only casting those 3 types. And then they force female actors into those roles, regardless of whether they're a good fit. If the result flops, they dump the blame on the actress. But it's not your fault. Acting is just one part of the filmmaking machine. Even with your beauty in youth and your phenomenal acting skill, it's possible to end up in a film that looks like crap thanks to bad lighting or a terrible edit. Directors, editors, producers, any of them can ruin a movie. But how many of them ever admit fault? Hardly any. The actor always becomes the scapegoat. Given the right script, a capable director, and a producer who isn't blindly overconfident, someone like you could easily deliver yet another classic performance. A successful film is a perfect storm of many things going right. And likewise, failure is rarely just one person's fault. In my view, the actor is usually the least responsible. Actors are selected through auditions. They perform under the director's vision. If an actor truly delivers a bad performance, isn't it the fault of the casting team? There are hundreds of actors in Hollywood. If this is the best one available, then the failure lies elsewhere. And if the actor does a fantastic job and the film still flops, well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out who's really to blame. And honestly, what's wrong with selling nostalgia? Would the audience rather watch a newbie who just looks the part but can't act? Or someone seasoned and talented who knows how to bring depth to a role? What sounded like a passionate defense still didn't entirely sit well with Catherine. She raised an eyebrow and said, "While I agree with most of what you said, there's still a tone in your words that says, 'You're old now, so go play old lady roles.' And that, my dear boy, is infuriating." Henry winced and said sheepishly, "That wasn't the point I was trying to make." From the side, Tony burst out laughing and said, "Right, Catherine, don't let him off the hook. This guy's got a bit of wit, and suddenly thinks he's smarter than everyone else. Time someone put him in his place." Everyone at the table turned to Tony with a look that said, "Seriously?" Catherine gave the death blow. "Little Tony, have you listened to your own words? Why is it that you think that flaw only applies to others?" That one hit home. Tony looked like he wanted to argue, but wisely held his tongue. Katharine Hepburn had a way of spotting exactly where to jab the knife with her words. Even a genius like Tony Stark wasn't immune. That had been confirmed across 2 generations of Starks. Trying to escape, Tony turned to the relatively quiet Mr. Hart and said, "Alex, how about we go chat in the study? My father kept a stash of rare whiskey there." Howard's stash? Now that's worth tasting. If I waited for him to offer it, I'd be 6 feet under before it happened. The financial tycoon got up and followed Tony, leaving his wife behind with Catherine and Henry. The fact that Henry had been left with the 2 women, both of whom were intentionally steering the conversation toward film, was a subtle but clear signal. The real discussion was happening elsewhere. Henry wasn't so dense as to demand a glass of whiskey at a time like this. In truth, Alex Hart and his wife had only come because of Catherine. Tony had asked her to extend the invitation. It just so happened that Hart was vacationing in California, a rare occurrence since he typically worked out of New York. That gave Tony an opening. And of course, Hart hadn't accepted the invitation out of friendship. If anyone in the Stark family could pull that off, it would have been Howard. For Tony, who was essentially just some rich kid to him, there had to be an agenda behind the invite. Hart was curious what that agenda was, and that curiosity is what got him to this private dinner. Howard Stark's study was nothing like the kind of room you'd expect in a typical wealthy household. There weren't shelves of leather-bound books or antique tomes left untouched for years, purely for show. Instead, the room was filled with journals, bound manuscripts, and printed book drafts. Some stood upright, others piled up haphazardly. Every single book, or book-like item, in this room looked like it had been flipped through countless times. Sticky tabs poked out from the top and sides, and some open volumes lay stacked on particular pages. Upon entering, Alex Hart immediately noticed that while the books seemed to be in disarray, the room itself hadn't seen its owner in quite some time. Even with regular cleaning, a fine layer of dust was still visible in the corners. Tony Stark closed the door behind them and poured 2 wide glasses of whiskey from the liquor cabinet, one for himself and one for his guest. Taking a sip, Alex swirled the amber liquid in his glass and said, "No doubt about it. Howard's private stash. This is excellent." Tony took a sip too. although it didn't taste quite like it had when he sneaked in here as a teenager. After sampling his fair share of cheap bar booze, he could now tell the real thing from the garbage. "Tony," Alex began. "I can call you Tony, can't I?" "You can." "Well then, Tony, I assume you didn't go through the trouble of inviting me here, through Catherine, just to raid your father's liquor cabinet?" The pleasantries had been exhausted in the living room, so the financial tycoon got straight to the point. Tony didn't bother beating around the bush either. "You remember that recent shooting incident, the one I was involved in?" "Oh, that one. Yeah, I heard something about it. Word was that a number of Silicon Valley, what do you call them, new money types got caught up in it. But the story just sort of disappeared. No follow-up from the media." "Exactly," Tony said. "But what if I told you the FBI agents who showed up that night weren't real agents, and that the gunmen I helped take down, including the bodies, completely vanished afterward? Does that sound normal to you?" Alex paused for a moment, then asked, "You've been digging into this?" "I was there," Tony said flatly. "Of course I wanted to know what happened next." "You didn't ask Howard?" "I'm an adult. I don't need some so-called father figure looking out for me." Alex let out a soft sigh. "All right then, go on." Tony continued. "I asked the LAPD. They insist all case materials were handed over to the FBI. But when I contacted the FBI's Los Angeles field office, they swore they'd never received the case. No records, nothing. I also spoke with other people who were at the party, but all of them kept their mouths shut, as if nothing had ever happened. So I started digging deeper. Trouble is, this runs deeper than I expected. And frankly, I don't have the leverage to get the people who do know something to talk. But here's the thing. One of the shooters said the whole thing was meant as a warning. That's why they did it so publicly, in front of people they knew they couldn't afford to cross. So I thought, rather than chasing down shadows, why not find someone who understands what that warning means and just ask them directly? "So you came to me?" Alex said with a bitter smile. "I'll say it again. You should have asked Howard. That'd be the smart move." "I won't," Tony said firmly, pointing at the man in front of him. The message was clear. Alex downed the rest of his whiskey in one gulp and refilled his glass. "You're entitled to know, so telling you doesn't cross any lines. But once we step out of this room, I'll deny everything. If you try to drag me into it, I'll say this was just the paranoid delusion of a so-called genius. Let's not get to that point." Tony zipped his lips in pantomime. "I just want to know what's behind all of this." Alex cleared his throat and began. "There's an island off the coast of California. On that island, some very wealthy people enjoy certain private entertainments, activities that might not align with the laws of any U.S. state. So, everyone involved keeps quiet out of mutual understanding." "You mean something like that Hollywood red couch rumor?" Tony asked. "Maybe even wilder," Alex replied. Then quickly added, "And don't get the wrong idea. I've never been there. Yes, they do send out invitations, but whether or not to go is up to the individual." Tony frowned. "Wilder? What else could they possibly be doing out there? Even without the island, these people aren't exactly saints. Don't assume the only thing going on is debauchery, Tony," Alex warned. "That island also offers medical services, the kind you won't find at any legitimate hospital." That clue was all Tony needed. Suddenly, it all clicked. Many of the roadblocks in medicine weren't due to technological limits, but ethical ones. As the realization sank in, Tony felt a surge of revulsion toward this so-called island. Alex noticed the change in his expression and offered a word of caution. "Don't be so quick to label this as evil. The fact that it exists means it fulfills a need. Think of it like contraband. No matter how hard you try, you can't truly get rid of it. One day, you or someone close to you might need something they offer. And if that day comes, you'll be glad the island exists. So what does that have to do with the so-called warning?" Tony asked, abandoning the moral debate in favor of the practical one. Alex said, "Because services like that, ones the average person could never afford, aren't meant to be known by the general public. What would happen if poor people found out? People who can barely make rent? They do one of two things. Demand the same services for free, or try to make sure nobody gets them. Either way, it's a problem. Just like that old saying, they never ask what they can do for the country, only what the country can do for them. So the guy who got killed, he was a loudmouth. Tony asked. Exactly. He told too many people who hadn't been properly vetted. The powers behind it all don't want anything happening out of their line of sight. That's why they shut him up. And at the same time, sent a warning to the rest. Who's the one in charge? Tony Stark asked. Alex replied candidly. At my level, I don't know their identities. But there are two people currently vying to become the public face. Who? A little guy named Epstein and a black man they call Puff Daddy. Hey, black man. Tony was stunned. Yeah, that's how bizarre this world is. A guy who clawed his way into a considerable amount of Hollywood resources through vulgar means now thinks he's on equal footing with us. I remember that guy. Wasn't he? A fairly new upstart rapper. He's got some smarts, I'll give him that. But no self-awareness. Tony asked, so one of those two hired the assassins? No. The killers were just hired help, I think. Same goes for the fake FBI agents you mentioned. They were probably part of a cleanup crew. Which assassin organization has the strength to pull that off? CIA. Maybe the CIA has a hand in it behind the scenes. I can't say for sure. But if I had to guess, the only group on the West Coast capable of impersonating the FBI and covering things up like that would be that one organization. Which one? The Continental Hotel. Ever heard of it, Tony? No, never. How do I find them? Why bother? Alex said, it's just a tool. Even if you do find them and demand justice, as long as you pay enough, the people who crossed you will disappear the next day. But the organization itself will remain. You can't destroy them, unless all you want is a bit of catharsis. Isn't anyone going to do something about all this? Tony growled, visibly frustrated. Alex took a drink and spoke some harsh truths. It's still a part of America. Just like how we live on a planet where you can't keep only the daylight and wish away the night. Tony fell silent. After a moment, he downed the rest of his whiskey and asked, there's one more thing I want to know. Go ahead, but I can't promise I'll have an answer. My father, Howard, was he involved in any of this? I'm not sure if you're more afraid that he was involved or disappointed that he wasn't. But I can tell you the answer. He wasn't. You're sure? Let's put it this way, Tony. These dealings have been around for a long time. Howard was a genius, no doubt. And with that genius, he won the military's favor and amassed considerable wealth. But he still wasn't qualified to join those circles. Alex added, I hope that answer doesn't offend you. But it's the truth. Howard was smart. He had resources, but not enough to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. Maybe if you take over and keep growing Stark Industries over the next few generations, improving and expanding, then one day, without even applying, you'll be invited into that circle. And who are they? Tony asked. Raising his glass, Alex listed off calmly, whether you've heard of them or not. The Red Shoe Club, the White Rope Society, Freemasons, the Illuminati, Yale Skull and Bones, Old Money, Blue Blood Aristocrats, or even Hydra. Some are still active, some have vanished into history, others simply went underground. But all of them are just small subsets of a much larger whole, a collective without a name, rituals, or public identity. There's no formal gatherings or oaths. But once you reach a certain height, your vision will naturally begin to see that landscape. Disgusting, Tony muttered. They actually think it's an honor to be part of their little club. Of course, not everyone wants in, Alex said, following Tony's tone. That's why they stay in the shadows. They can't become a formal power or organization. That's the only comforting fact in all this. Just as the two of them were about to continue talking, a servant knocked on the door. Young Master Tony, dinner is ready. Alex finished off his whiskey and said, that's about all I know. If you want to dig further, you'll have to find the rest of the answers yourself. I don't know anything more. All right, I handpicked tonight's French chef myself. Let's hope his cooking won't disappoint. Let's go then. At the dining table, Henry and the others had already taken their seats. Since the two new arrivals were men, no one stood up to greet them. When Katharine Hepburn saw Tony return, she immediately chuckled and said, Little Tony, where exactly did you meet this friend of yours? He doesn't quite feel like someone Stark would know. Her smiling words held a blade. Tony Stark found himself momentarily speechless. Henry, however, responded with a laugh. How should I put it? Let's just say our first meeting wasn't exactly a friendly one. Katharine, Are you sure you want to hear this kind of story? Oh, unfriendly, huh? That makes it even more worth hearing, doesn't it? Catherine replied with a grin, eyes fixed on the flustered Tony. Tony pointed at Henry and said, "You, don't say a word." Then quickly turned to the servant and added, "And you, serve the food now." Catherine laughed joyfully. "Anything that can make a Stark man this uncomfortable. I'm dying to hear more." Tony stubbornly retorted, "There's nothing interesting about it. And besides, I was the one who looked after him. If I hadn't, he'd be dead." "Oh, Henry, is that true?" Catherine turned to him, asking with interest. Spreading his hands with a smile, Henry replied, "Absolutely. Just as Mr. Stark said. It was unwise to get too familiar too quickly. Going around poking fun at someone when the relationship wasn't deep enough only bred resentment." Henry had no desire to offend Tony, though, ironically, this deferential attitude annoyed the younger Stark even more. Luckily, before Tony could say anything in return, the service team had already brought out the aperitifs, marking the official start of dinner. Tony downed his glass in one gulp, then gestured for a refill. The cool liquor helped him calm down a bit. Finally, he said, "I know what you're going to say, that if we'd done nothing, those gunmen would have left on their own. But how were we supposed to know that at the time?" "All right, I get it," Catherine said. "But what's this about gunmen? Little Tony, care to fully explain yourself?" "Oh, hell." Tony felt a chill run down his spine. He just spilled something he wasn't supposed to. He'd had two official stories, one for close acquaintances, saying he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, looking for a place to hide. The other, more public version was full of exaggerated bravado about taking down assassins single-handedly. No one expected that version to be true. Western dining has no such taboo as no talking while eating. In fact, the slow pace of serving courses is designed to let guests enjoy the food and engage in conversation, building connections in the process. Under Katharine Hepburn's firm insistence, Tony Stark reluctantly recounted how he first met Henry. Just after chewing through an asparagus spear, Catherine quipped, "So, what you're saying is, on your very first meeting, both little Tony and that other fellow got thoroughly embarrassed by Henry." "I did not. The one who got embarrassed was that guy, not me." Tony protested, trying to defend himself. Catherine turned to Henry. "And you, Henry? Could you really solve such complex problems just by glancing at them?" Henry smiled and replied, "Of course not. Even the most brilliant mathematicians need tools to work through some problems. How could I possibly know the answer at a glance?" "Then how did you do it?" "Well, if you speak with enough confidence, sound dead serious, those lacking confidence will naturally believe you. That's why people love movies so much. If audiences scrutinized every plot hole, logical gap, or impossible physics in films, nobody would watch them." Catherine nodded, satisfied. "Now that sounds like a real filmmaker. If you don't believe in your own work, how can you convince the studios or the audience to believe in it?" Finally finding a chance to cut in, Tony muttered, "But that's not scientific at all." Even now, he wasn't entirely sure whether Henry had really guessed the answer back then or had just bluffed, though oddly, it had matched his own answer. Catherine countered, "Tony, we're talking about the movie channel, not the Discovery Channel. If science dictated everything, Star Wars would have flopped decades ago." Tony grumbled under his breath, "Still not scientific." Catherine continued, "So, during your second meeting, Tony was actually rude enough to just start eating off the table without asking?" She always had a knack for approaching any topic from a completely fresh angle. Tony defended himself. "That meal was funded entirely out of my own pocket, including the chef team and ingredients. Why shouldn't I eat the food I paid for?" Henry nodded quickly and chimed in, "Exactly. Of course you can eat it. But maybe you could, I don't know, introduce yourself first, so people realize the stranger eating everyone's food is actually the host, not some homeless guy." Then he turned to Catherine and asked, "Is that just a Stark family trait? Thinking everyone should recognize them wherever they go? Sounds like a chronic overconfidence issue." "It's a full-blown hereditary illness," Catherine replied with a straight face. "One can only hope the next generation improves." She pivoted. "By the way, Henry, I know that the third time you two met, you were following Tony around shooting people from behind. But what happened before that? Why were you soaking wet and looking like a mess? Tony had never asked that question himself, but it didn't mean he wasn't curious. So when Catherine brought it up, he stayed quiet for once, waiting to hear the story. Henry recounted the incident where he bumped into Justin Hammer again, and how a chubby little rich kid threw his expensive phone into the pool and made Henry retrieve it. After the story, Tony said, "So that's why you didn't want to save him? Because that fat bastard pissed you off first." Henry explained, "I should clarify, I didn't even realize that guy, Josh Hilton, was the target of the hit until later. At the time, a name was just a name. I didn't connect it to a person." Tony asked, "If you had a second chance, would you save him?" "Still no," Henry replied, uncharacteristically serious. "Let's set aside what the job required. Bodyguards at parties are there to deal with drunks or rowdy guests, not people with guns. Besides, I was already off the job. I was just a civilian by then, unarmed. My first priority was protecting myself, not cleaning up messes made by rich kids." "But you still helped Tony," Catherine pointed out. Tony interjected, "Hey, I brought him along, not the other way around. He wasn't some gunslinging rookie, so I figure at least he'd give the bad guys something to think about. That's why I kept him around." Exactly, Henry echoed, voice dripping with sarcasm. Not that any of the Americans at the table could catch the sarcasm. Henry wasn't about to explain it either. He just let Tony boast about his own heroics while he focused on wrestling the asparagus on his plate, which, strangely enough, was the main course tonight. Considering the age of their hostess, Katharine Hepburn, who was already 84 years old, Tony had ensured the chef and nutritionist worked together to design the optimal menu. There was some meat served, but it was soft and in small portions, easy to chew for elderly guests. Alex Hart and his wife, both at the age where health-conscious eating was a priority, found no reason to complain. As for the two younger men, they devoured the meal with equal enthusiasm. In fact, Henry's table manners were noticeably more refined than Tony's, even going so far as to chat with the servers in fluent French, complimenting the food. These little things quietly earned Henry even more goodwill from the elders at the table. With a kind and gentle gaze, Catherine asked, "So, Henry, what are your plans for the future? Tony says you're a small-time actor in Hollywood right now." Was she planning to use her connections in the film industry to help Tony repay the favor? It seemed the old star still had a soft spot for this young man, who was about the same age as her grandchildren. But Henry politely declined the offer. Shaking his head, he said, "I came to Hollywood just to see the world. It's been less than 6 months, but I already feel I might change careers sooner or later." Catherine smiled. "You don't want to become a big star?" "Rather than say I don't want to be a big star, I'd say I'm unwilling to pay the price it takes to become one. I prefer to live more freely." What Henry didn't say aloud, even though Catherine still held sway in Hollywood, she wasn't some kingmaker. If she really wanted to make someone, she wasn't the kind of golden ticket to bet your life on. Besides, the favor Tony owed him wasn't big enough for Catherine to go all out repaying it. If this was just a chance, a casual opportunity, Henry wasn't going to risk his future in Hollywood on it. After hearing Henry's response, Katharine Hepburn sighed. "What a shame. When I was young, I loved acting so much that I let it blind me. I didn't see what kind of place Hollywood really was. By the time I finally saw clearly, I was already caught in the whirlpool, unable to escape. If I had the chance to do it all over again, maybe I would have stayed in that little theater instead." Henry said regretfully. "Then the world would have been short one major star named Katharine Hepburn. I don't want to keep walking down the road of film because I just don't think I have the hope or the fit to become a real star." "Oh, but you seem to perform quite well," Catherine replied, her eyes narrowing with a sly glint. "Yeah, so you noticed." Henry didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it either. In that case, Catherine sipped her wine, thought for a moment, and asked, "Can you drive?" Henry nodded. "I can." She turned toward Tony. "Tony, what did you think of Henry's performance?" "What performance?" Tony blinked. "His performance during the gunfight," Catherine clarified. Tony scoffed. "He did okay. At least he didn't hold me back." Then he frowned. "Why are you asking this, Catherine?" Catherine explained, "Well, you know I'm also friends with the other Miss Hepburn." She made air quotes around the name as she said it. Her driver recently retired. Ever since she became a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador in 1988, she's been traveling the world. She's had another trip coming up to Somalia, and I heard things are a bit unstable. So I thought maybe I could find her a reliable driver, preferably someone who can also serve as a bodyguard on these trips. Henry's eyes lit up like fireworks. He nodded vigorously, pointing to himself repeatedly. If he had a tail, it would have been wagging fast enough to lift him off the ground like a helicopter. Catherine didn't seem annoyed by his self-recommendation, but she said, "I just want to know if you've got enough weight behind you, something that would make me confident enough to recommend you to Audrey as her new driver." Henry understood her concern perfectly. After all, this was his first meeting with Catherine. Recommending him to her close friend just because she had a good impression of him would be risky. If anything were to go wrong, even if she wasn't held liable, the guilt might weigh on her for the rest of her life. For people in their circles, hiring someone wasn't just a matter of sitting through an interview. They often ran background checks, reviewed 3 generations of family history, and tested loyalty before even considering someone. If she only wanted a professional, she could easily hire a former soldier with a clean record. So, did Henry have something of greater value that made him worth recommending? As Catherine spoke, her eyes shifted to Tony Stark. She wanted to know if Tony's opinion of Henry was enough to give her confidence. But Henry wasn't about to bet on Tony's goodwill. He knew very well that their bond wasn't that strong. If anything, he suspected Tony only invited him to this private dinner to see him squirm in front of Hepburn, using her as bait for some personal amusement. Whether or not that had paid off, Henry didn't know. But he certainly wasn't going to rely on Tony's endorsement. He'd rather raise his own stakes. Even if it meant exposing some of his secrets, a thing he usually avoided for the sake of his peaceful Kryptonian slacker life. Meeting Audrey Hepburn in person? Yeah, for that, a little exposure might just be worth it. He made his decision almost instantly. "Tony, my friend," Henry said, "do you have a gun? A pistol is fine. Lend me one." "What the hell? What do you need a gun for?" Tony frowned. "You don't strike me as the type who believes in hell, but if you're thinking about going there, try a different method." Tony jabbed back without missing a beat. Henry turned away from him and looked to the financial mogul at the table. "Mr. Hart, I know this is a strange request, but I promise I don't intend to hurt anyone. I just want to prove a small point, one that's better shown than told. Do you happen to have a firearm?" Alex Hart gave him a thoughtful look. "Maybe my driver has one. Want me to call him in? I'd appreciate that." Soon enough, a tall, broad-shouldered white man in a black suit arrived at the dining room, led by one of the villa's servants. Henry looked him over and said, "Sir, are you carrying a firearm? If so, may I borrow it for a moment?" The bodyguard immediately looked to his employer. No way was he handing over a weapon to a stranger, not while unarmed himself. Even Alex Hart, who was admittedly curious about what Henry was planning, hesitated. Letting a stranger handle a weapon could be a very bad idea. Seeing their reluctance, Henry amended, "Okay, new plan. You don't need to give me the gun. Just shoot me in the hand." "Excuse me?" The bodyguard blinked. "Yes, just shoot me in the palm," Henry said calmly, stretching his right arm out to the side, away from his body. "You can stand a bit closer if you're worried about missing." Now Hart nodded to his bodyguard, having made up his mind. The man carefully drew a Beretta 92F from his shoulder holster, then leveled it at Henry's outstretched hand. He kept a safe distance, even while double and triple checking. "Sir, are you absolutely sure you want me to shoot your hand?" "Yes, I'm sure," Henry replied. "You won't regret this later." "What's to regret? Just pull the trigger. And don't be a pussy." Bang! The shot shocked everyone at the table. But Henry's palm only dipped slightly under the impact. His hand recoiled a bit, but that was it. No blood. No bullet hole. He calmly turned his hand to show everyone. "See? I'm fine," Henry said with a smug grin. "Wow!" Catherine was the first to exclaim in amazement. "Little Henry, are you seriously bulletproof?" "Well, I'll admit, it does hurt, but the bullet doesn't go through." Henry told a small lie. Truth be told, there was no pain at all. Even a slight indentation in his palm and the recoil were just for show. He didn't want to come across as too inhuman in front of others. "Wait a minute," Tony Stark shouted, cutting off everyone else before they could speak. He lowered his head in deep thought. Let me think this through first. What is there to think about? Henry asked, confused. So you're saying, Tony began, during the shootout, you were basically walking around in an invisible bulletproof suit behind me. And I, like an idiot, thought you needed protection, so I kept shielding you, putting myself in danger. Is that it? Henry shrugged, wearing an infuriatingly innocent expression. Mr. Stark, I seem to recall advising you not to get involved in the gunfight. I told you to hide somewhere safe. And as for what happened afterward, why can't you see it as me covering your back for surprise attacks? Not that anyone actually tried to shoot you from behind. Tony jumped to his feet, getting more and more agitated. So I was like some naked fool, charging at professional killers with a pistol. Well, you could have just walked up to them and knocked them out one by one. That's what you're saying. Henry answered seriously. That's impossible. Any sane person, upon realizing their bullets don't work on the enemy and seeing them walking forward unscathed, would just run away. No one's stupid enough to stick around. He cleverly dodged the part about punching people into next week. So what you're saying, Tony slammed his hand on the table, is that what I thought was a life-or-death battle was for you? Basically like playing paintball in a backyard survival game. Well, sir, if that's how you want to put it then, I wouldn't say you're wrong, but I'd suggest calming down and looking at the bigger picture. How the hell am I supposed to calm down? You never told me any of this. If you had, I could have come up with a better plan instead of playing hero like an idiot. Seriously now, Henry widened his eyes and put on a mock-shocked face. Who in their right mind goes around announcing, "Hi, I'm Henry Brown. I'm bulletproof." 90% of people would think I'm crazy. The other 10 would assume I'm joking. And even if I wasn't, how would I prove it to them? Well, you just proved it tonight. Tony snapped. That's because this is a job interview. I had to provide proof that I'm qualified as a driver and a bodyguard. Otherwise, what do you want me to do? Pull out a gun and shoot myself every time I meet someone new? Even a lunatic wouldn't go that far. But you could have told me. Whether I believe you or not is my problem. Oh, so tell me, Mr. Stark, do you go around introducing yourself like, "Hi, I'm Tony Stark. My dad is Howard Stark. I'm heir to Stark Industries, and I'm a certified genius at Caltech." Wait, Tony interrupted indignantly. I enrolled in MIT's electrical engineering program at 14 and earned my PhD in engineering physics. I'm only visiting Caltech while working on another doctorate in aerospace engineering. So yes, I'm a genius. But I'm definitely not just some random Caltech student. Sure. Henry rolled his eyes and raised his hands dramatically. But do you go around bragging about that to everyone you meet? Like a peacock flashing its feathers? Of course not. I don't need to flaunt it. And let me just say, I've never taken a cent from my family since I turned 12. I paid all my tuition and expenses using patent royalties. I earned myself. Exactly. So why expect me to announce my abilities to everyone when you don't? Seems a bit hypocritical, Mr. Stark. Maybe Henry's sarcasm hit a nerve, because Tony's anger suddenly took a sharp turn. His tone dropped. I told you, call me Tony. The only thing I share with that other Stark is DNA. Nothing more. Henry looked around at the lavish mansion, the 5-figure outfit Tony was wearing, and the multi-course French meal in front of them, already a dessert. He couldn't help but jab. And I suppose your genius brain thinks the only kind of support that counts is cash in hand. What? Inheriting Stark Industries doesn't count. Everything you have here, this house, your clothes, your lifestyle, you earned all of that yourself. Tony stiffened, clearly struck by the remark. He grumbled, having a place to live, clothes to wear, food to eat. That's normal, isn't it? If I refused even those, wouldn't that be a little too dramatic? Sure, Henry replied with a shrug. Whatever helps you sleep at night. Tony hesitated for a moment, then said, So, you could have saved Josh Hilton, right? No, I couldn't. Not in a million years would Henry admit he could have saved the guy. And besides, he didn't want to. What was Tony going to do about it? That's impossible. You're bulletproof. You could have taken a shot for him. You're telling me you let an innocent man die because you held a grudge? I don't know if that guy was innocent. I'm not a judge, Henry replied coolly. And if I were going to save him, I'd have had to run across the pool, beat the bullet, and jump in front of a man wider than I am tall. You really think the gunman would have let me do that? Considering the pool layout and the hostages being controlled by the shooters, it really would have been impossible to get there in time, unless you had literal super speed. Still, Tony protested, but you didn't even try. And wasting effort on something I know I can't do. That's what saints do. Me? I'm just an average guy with a little something extra. But with your abilities, you could help so many more people, Tony insisted. Henry didn't bother wasting time in a philosophical morality debate. He shot back directly. Tony, your family's rich, right? Actually, forget your family. You yourself are rich, no question. Though a little annoyed, Tony didn't deny it. Yeah, being rich isn't a crime, is it? Of course not. So let's say you, or your family, took all that money and gave $10,000 to every poor person. Wouldn't that eliminate poverty in America? Sound great, doesn't it? Tony blinked, surprised. That's not how wealth redistribution works. Want me to lend you a few econ textbooks? Besides, what does my wealth have to do with poor people? Exactly. Your money is your business. You're under no obligation to share it with anyone, Henry said smoothly. So, just because I'm bulletproof, I should be required to throw myself in front of every bullet? Every time someone gets shot somewhere in the world, am I to blame because I didn't step in? Tony wasn't convinced by the analogy. Stark Industries does fun, charitable programs, you know? We do help people, just not by blindly handing out cash. And no, it's not your fault when strangers get shot. But when someone's getting gunned down right in front of you and you don't step in, that's a waste of a gift. Wow, Henry thought, this guy really is destined to become a hero. With his wealth and connections, Tony Stark could have helped people in 1,000 ways. Yet in the future, he'd still choose to put his own life on the line. Henry respected that deeply, but that didn't mean he had to follow the same code. So Henry responded sincerely. In my opinion, not using my powers for evil is already the greatest kindness I can offer the world. I don't mind helping people, but I'm not going to sacrifice myself for everyone indiscriminately. I have no obligation, and frankly, not enough incentive. How about this? Tony said, finally flexing his greatest power, money. $1 million a year. Work for me. Take my orders. Henry smiled sweetly, then immediately said, nope. Why not? It's basically the same job as being Audrey Hepburn's driver and bodyguard. Or are you saying it's not enough money? Tisk, TSK. Henry wagged a finger. I don't know exactly what you'd hire me to do, but I'm guessing it's bodyguard work, a human meat shield. Or, more likely, playing vigilante, running around looking for trouble. I mean, helping people for free just to stroke your own ego. You're paying me for it, not demanding I work for free. That's admirable. But serving you and serving Miss Hepburn, those are two very different things. They're totally the same. Tony protested. Henry leaned forward, voice earnest. Working for Tony Stark? $1 million a year. Sure, but how much would I have to spend on therapy to recover from the trauma of being bossed around by you? Working for Miss Hepburn, well, I don't know what the going rate for a private driver is. 30 grand? 50? Doesn't matter. Serving someone like her, and her namesake, is priceless. From her seat, Catherine clapped her hands. Oh my, that was the most delightful thing I've heard all evening. What a sweet boy. Come here. I'll feed you a spoonful of pudding. Henry obediently leaned over like a good grandson. Catherine, smiling like a doting grandmother, spooned pudding into his mouth. One looked delighted to feed. The other made a show of savoring the taste like it was nectar from the gods. Their exaggerated theatrics were utterly shameless and absolutely hilarious. Henry sighed dramatically, eyes half-lidded with joy. Pudding fed by Katharine Hepburn herself. The taste is on a whole other level. Tony, visibly annoyed, shouted, "It's the same pudding, the exact same." Then he grabbed his own dessert and dramatically stuffed the whole thing into his mouth in protest. Henry shook his head and clucked his tongue. TSK. This is the problem with scientists. They don't understand an artist's sense of romance. Sure, the chemical composition and physical properties are identical, but the experience of how it's delivered, that makes all the difference. He added with a sly smile, If Mr. Tony here ever gives someone a gift, I bet he'd just tell them to go buy it themselves, say happy birthday to themselves, and then submit the receipt to Stark Industries for reimbursement. You probably wouldn't even care what they bought. As it happened, that was exactly something future Tony Stark would do. Catherine burst into laughter. A real, full-throated laugh. The rest of the table looked confused at first, then dawned with realization. Henry asked, "Wait, don't tell me. Old man Stark actually did that." Tony winced. Catherine nodded enthusiastically, tears of mirth in her eyes. "I was beginning to think you'd heard that story from someone. That's exactly what Howard used to do. If anyone says the Starks aren't blood relatives," Henry thought, "I'll fight them on the spot." Whatever other adventures Howard Stark had gotten up to, clearly his son had inherited the quirks and the consequences. How did Tony and Catherine know each other, anyway? With a 60-year age gap, it wasn't like they'd met at a bar. Probably something to do with Howard's colorful past. Henry figured he'd better not push that line of questioning too far. That was a surefire way to attract unwanted heat. Besides, Catherine's mental armor was maxed out. Even the future Iron Man wouldn't dare lay a finger on her. She was the ultimate tank, and she took great pleasure in charging full force at Tony every chance she got, as if making up for all the slights his father had ever dealt her. A classic case of a son paying for his father's debts. As a committed slacker and chaos enthusiast, Henry couldn't help but feel disappointed he didn't have a camera on hand to capture this historic moment. The footage would have made a killer blackmail reel, maybe even last someone straight into their grave. Still, Catherine knew her limits. She wouldn't push Tony so far that he'd lose face. That ability to read the room with laser precision, that's how she survived in Hollywood for decades. Everyone at the table was a seasoned player, except, perhaps, for future Iron Man himself. Tony Stark, in this moment, was nothing but a wide-eyed little bunny. After dinner, unlike other soirees filled with after-parties or late-night activities, this gathering ended quietly. Alex and Mrs. Hart were the first to leave. Before going, Mr. Hart handed Henry a private business card and also took down Henry's number. The look in his eyes was hard to read. Catherine, meanwhile, was staying in the Stark family's Beverly Hills villa. This was her temporary home while in Los Angeles. She wasn't going anywhere, but she still exchanged contact information with Henry and said warmly, "I'll reach out to Audrey about the job. Neither of us lives in LA, so if you want to meet the other Hepburn lady you admire so much, you'll have to wait for us to arrange something. The decision's hers, of course. I hope you understand that, child." "I do, Catherine," Henry replied politely without saying more. After all, saying too much might just provoke the green-eyed monster in this Hepburn lady. In an 80-something-year-old vintage jealousy, even a Kryptonian might not survive that. As Henry stepped out the front door, he was surprised to see the flashy red Ferrari still parked out front. Tony was leaning against it, puffing on a cigarette. When he saw Henry emerge, he stubbed it out and said, "Get in. I'll take you home." "Well, well," Henry teased. "And here I thought I'd be walking back tonight." Tony scowled. "I brought you here, didn't I? Sending you back is only fair. Besides, I'd rather not have you wandering through rich people neighborhoods all night. You probably won't run into a mugging, but nosy cops? That's a given. So get in. Unless you want me to kick your ass, then you'll be riding in the front trunk." This Ferrari had a mid-engine layout, so its storage compartment was up front. Henry's X-ray vision confirmed. To fit inside, he'd have to fold his arms or legs like a pretzel. No thanks. So he obediently got in. Tony slammed on the gas, and the car surged forward. Henry was plastered against the seat as the engine roared up to redline, as if the car itself was venting Tony's frustration. Despite being a grip-heavy sports car, Tony managed to pull off a drift on the narrow drive. The iron gate had opened just enough to let them through as they sped out, clearly timed to perfection. Henry had to admit, Tony Stark was a gifted driver. No wonder he could compete in actual races, like the Monaco Grand Prix in the films. Okay, maybe it was an F1 level, probably F2, but even getting that far was no joke. Racing licenses weren't easy to get, and not just anyone could race competitively. But once they hit public roads, Tony calmed down. He stayed within the speed limit, and the engine settled into a low hum, neither sluggish nor revving high. That's when Henry knew Tony had something to say. Otherwise, he would have just dumped him off at the curb. Still stewing over being rejected, Tony finally said, "Why didn't you take the job I offered?" Henry chuckled. "Bringing this up again, huh? Well then, what do you think I can do besides take a bullet?" Tony was momentarily speechless. After a pause, he tried. "Actually, someone like you, a mutant, should be using your gifts to blend in better with regular society, shouldn't you?" "So he thinks I'm a mutant." Henry didn't bother correcting him. Instead, he asked, "Tell me, Tony, who hires the top lawyers in America? Who can afford the best legal minds in the country?" Tony had no answer. Henry went on, "If someone needs to hire me to take a bullet, they must have done something to make people want to shoot them. And let's be real, 9 out of 10 people like that, they're probably scumbags. The one decent guy probably couldn't even afford my rate. So, if I make money by turning a blind eye to morality, is that really something to be proud of? Now let's say I go full vigilante, run around playing hero, saving people for free. But by the time I show up, they might already be dead. And just my luck, I'll get tackled by police and arrested as the suspect. What kind of idiot signs up for a job like that?" Tony didn't respond. Henry shrugged. "So working for Miss Hepburn as a driver and bodyguard? That's the best deal I can think of. She's a good person. I'll be useful in a place like Africa. And she'll at least pay me a proper wage. Unlike broke people who expect me to work for free." Tony realized then, Henry wasn't refusing to help people. He just had standards. And honestly, they were hard to argue with. Henry added, "If turning you down upset you, I'm sorry. But I want to be clear, I wasn't really rejecting you. Percy, surely that much is obvious, right? Genius Tony Stark." "Just call me Tony," he muttered. "Enough with the Mr. Star crap." Then he asked, "You were really trying to reject Alex?" "Of course. Didn't you see how his eyes lit up when he saw me take a bullet? But I couldn't exactly be blunt to someone I just met. You and I have met a few times. Plus, with Catherine around cracking jokes, I figured I could turn down your offer without offending anyone. That was the best outcome I could hope for. Honestly, I don't want to know what someone like him would use me for." Tony thought back to what Alex had told him earlier, those dark secrets. Could someone like that really be as uninvolved as he claimed? "If you were worried about him," Tony said, "you could have kept your abilities hidden, made a more normal offer." Henry scoffed. "If I acted like a regular guy, someone with your resources could find 100 more qualified candidates. People better trained, more trustworthy. What do I have to offer? Charm? Oh wait, I forgot. Stark family heir. Your life's been on easy mode since birth. You have no idea how hard it is for nobodies like me to even step foot in your world. And if I don't flash something truly extraordinary, how would you even remember me? You think having a few chats, most of them unpleasant, makes us friends? If we were really friends when Catherine asked you about me, your answer would have been a hell of a lot more confident. And you wouldn't have dangled the other Hepburn lady in front of me like bait, just to see if I make a fool of myself. But I'm not mad. Whether tonight's performance satisfied you or not, I gave it my all. This was my way of repaying you for giving me the opportunity. Truly, I'm grateful. No sarcasm." He smiled thinly. "Besides, let's be honest, our paths probably won't cross much going forward. I'm not the son of a billionaire. I don't belong to your circle." The car pulled up at Henry's place. He stepped out without being asked, then turned and gave a deep, theatrical bow, the kind you'd see in an opera. "Farewell, Mr. Tony Stark," he said with a charming, professional smile. "Goodbye. Goodbye forever. I hope we never meet again." Tony Stark remained silent, and that silence said everything. Returning once again to the Stark family's villa, Henry arrived driving his vintage 1965 third-generation Cadillac DeVille. Standing beside the passenger seat, he held a single red rose in his hand, waiting to welcome Katharine Hepburn aboard. The 84-year-old lady stepped out in a violet lady's suit, a wide-brimmed silk sun hat, and white opera-length gloves. Her look was unmistakably retro, yet radiated refined elegance. Henry offered her the rose and complimented. "Catherine, you look especially beautiful today. You've got a silver tongue, don't you? But I see there's only one flower for me. Catherine teased as she caught sight of a whole bouquet in the back seat. One blooming red rose is more than enough, Henry replied smoothly, opening the door with a gentlemanly flourish. Catherine tapped his head lightly with the rose and said, "Such a quick wit. I'm starting to wonder if I were 60 years younger, would I fall for that mouth of yours?" "It would have been the honor of a lifetime," Henry chuckled. Once seated in the passenger seat, Catherine tapped the glove box cover and said, "Well then, get moving. Today's the day you finally meet your movie idol. You wouldn't want to be late picking her up at the airport, would you? Relax. Her flight's scheduled to land at 10 a.m. We got plenty of time. By the way, Catherine, have you had breakfast yet?" "I have. We elders don't keep irregular eating schedules like you youngsters," she replied. So the drive passed with pleasant small talk until they arrived at LAX. After parking, they made their way to the arrival hall, where Catherine and Henry began playing a game, guessing who among the crowd were paparazzi. Being the airport closest to Hollywood, there were always tabloid reporters lying in wait, hoping to catch a glimpse of some A-lister arriving. Catherine's appearance didn't attract much attention. She was no longer in the limelight, after all. To the young reporters, she was just another well-dressed old lady. But before long, a poised, elderly beauty emerged from the terminal, wearing an ivory-white polka-dotted T-shirt, a peach-pink pleated skirt, draped in a silky white scarf, oversized sunglasses covering her face, and low pink heels. She carried two vintage-looking LV handbags, one large, one small. Despite the years, her dignified grace turned heads throughout the airport. Just as the younger crowd didn't recognize Catherine, no one recognized this elegant older woman either. Only Catherine stepped forward, arms open for a warm embrace. "Audrey, it's been far too long." "Catherine, you look as radiant as ever," replied the other Hepburn, returning the hug as the two old friends greeted one another warmly. Henry stood frozen like a statue, eyes wide with awe. It wasn't until Catherine gave him a nudge that he snapped out of it. He hurried forward with the bouquet he had prepared and stammered, "Miss Hepburn, welcome. I'm one of your biggest fans. It's such an honor to finally—" Overwhelmed with emotion, he couldn't even finish a complete sentence. His eyes welled up with tears. Truth be told, even meeting someone like Tony Stark didn't affect Henry this deeply. Stark had always seemed like a smart aleck kid to him, not exactly awe-inspiring. But Audrey Hepburn, even though age had taken its toll, no cream or silk scarf could hide the fine lines on her face. Still, that emotional surge of seeing someone who once represented light in a dark time was indescribable. Perhaps it was because after 20 years of chaos and torment since arriving in this world, those weeks he spent in Alaska binging on old films became more meaningful than he ever realized. In a way, the golden era Hollywood actresses had been the dawn that shattered his personal darkness. When John rescued him in Alaska, it was a salvation of the body. But seeing Audrey Hepburn in person, that was salvation for the soul. "Thank you. These flowers are beautiful," Audrey said, taking the bouquet. "You must be Mr. Brown?" "Yes, Henry Brown. But you can just call me Henry," he said, finally regaining control of his voice. Catherine, seeing how flustered Henry was, jumped in to ease the tension with humor. "Hey, Audrey, do you know what this guy said the first time he saw me?" "Oh, let me guess. Claimed to be a huge fan." Audrey smiled. "Nope." He went, "Oh, so this is that Hepburn lady." With a face so full of disappointment, I almost considered straightening his nose for him. Audrey blinked, then burst into laughter. "He really said that?" "Sure did. Can you picture the look on his face?" "I think I can," Audrey chuckled. "Do you remember Hubert de Givenchy? When I first visited him, he thought I was you, and he looked just as disappointed." "Well then," said Catherine, "I guess we're even. Is that something you even keep score over?" Audrey laughed, looping her arm through Catherine's. Their cheerful reunion began to attract curious glances. Two older ladies meeting at the airport might not be breaking news, but if one was named Catherine and the other Audrey, both referred to as Miss Hepburn, that was a headline waiting to happen. Having been famous long enough to sniff out paparazzi, both women sensed eyes on them. Catherine said, "Let's get to the car. You must be tired from a flight from Switzerland." "I got some rest on the plane," Audrey replied. But jet lag's still a thing. Catherine turned to Henry and said sternly, "Child, go get your movie idol's luggage. Honestly, I'm starting to question if you're really up for this job." "Why, yes, right away." Henry scrambled to grab her bags. "Allow me, ma'am." "Thank you, handsome," Audrey replied with a grin, still arm in arm with Catherine as they chatted nonstop about life, friends, and everything in between. Henry escorted them to the waiting area, then jogged off to the parking lot to bring the car around. He knew the interview for the job of Audrey Hepburn's personal driver had already begun. What he didn't know was what kind of first impression he'd made. "Is Robert not coming with you?" Catherine asked. Since her 1982 divorce from Andrea Diddy, Robert Wolders, the Dutch actor 7 years Audrey's junior, had become her officially acknowledged life partner. Though they never remarried, they maintained a relationship that was clearly more than friendship. Audrey often brought her younger partner to public events. The two had even met with then-President Ronald Reagan together. By comparison, Catherine had remained single since her divorce back in 1934 and never had children. That didn't mean she wasn't interested in her friend's love life. Hence the question. Audrey replied helplessly, "Robert isn't all that interested in the charitable trips to Africa, so he wasn't too keen on coming along this time. And I didn't want to force him." "Men," Catherine scoffed, launching into a sweeping critique. "They'll rush to bars and restaurants, but ask them to accompany someone somewhere meaningful, and it's like asking for their life." From the driver's seat, Henry called back with a helpless tone, "Hello, ladies. I'm being very well-behaved and driving properly here. Surely I don't deserve to be lumped in with that crowd. I'm wounded, you know." There, good boy. Just focus on the road," Catherine said dryly. "And no matter what you hear back here, just exclude yourself from it. That'll make you feel better." Sharp-tongued as ever, Catherine's remarks left Henry feeling slightly aggrieved. Audrey, ever more graceful, quickly stepped in to smooth things over. "Henry, how long have you been driving? Your handling's very smooth." Henry replied honestly, "I've had my license for about 6 months now. I learned driving in Alaska, one of those no-man's land places. I guess I've got some natural talent." All three statements were true, though there were plenty of unspoken details in between. But the quality of someone's driving is best judged by those actually riding in the car. And both Audrey and Catherine had plenty of experience riding with terrible drivers. Those who couldn't keep a steady speed, constantly jerking the gas pedal like they were trying to simulate ocean waves. Even on a straight road, some people could make you car sick. Catherine chimed in to support him. "Little Henry's doing pretty well, I'd say. At least he's not bouncing me around in this vintage car so badly I vomit up my breakfast." Henry feigned innocence and replied, "Catherine, I did ask if you wanted me to rent a different car for today, didn't I?" "Relax, dear child. No one's complaining about your old Cadillac," she reassured him. The third-generation Cadillac DeVille, a 1965 model, was considered a full-size luxury vehicle back in the day. While it might not compare to top-tier names like Bentley or Rolls-Royce, in its time it was plenty flashy, especially in the eyes of Hollywood's B-list stars. But these two aging beauties had seen it all. At their age, they no longer chased after glitz or glamour. Safety and comfort were what mattered most. And once Henry knew he'd be using this car to drive the two distinguished guests, he'd meticulously cleaned and detailed it, almost to the point of a full interior restoration. He paid particular attention to areas often overlooked, like odors and tight crevices, holding himself to the standard of a Kryptonian perfectionist. He nearly disassembled the whole thing just for thorough upkeep. As for performance, the car's previous owner had maintained it quite well and had no bad driving habits. That was a major reason Henry agreed to take it off his hands. All things considered, the car's only real flaw might be the paint, just not glossy enough. Even after waxing, it didn't quite gleam like a new model. But for two long-faded stars, that little imperfection was just right. They had no interest in reliving the old cat-and-mouse games with paparazzi. "Oh, right." Audrey suddenly pulled a business card from her handbag and handed it forward. "Henry, are you familiar with this address?" Henry glanced at the card as he drove. "Ronnie Insurance Management Agency?" Those similar to insurance agents, insurance managers act on behalf of the policyholder, not the insurer. Their job is to design optimal coverage plans tailored to the client. They typically work with multiple insurance companies and don't push any one brand. Their added value lies in helping clients meet eligibility for specialized coverage, maximizing protection while lowering premiums. Audrey's next words aligned perfectly with that understanding. Ronnie told me that if I want to purchase insurance for this upcoming trip to Somalia, I'll need to be accompanied by a professional security team. He helped me get in touch with one. One reason I came to LA this time was to meet with that team. If everything checks out, I'll sign a contract with them. A security team? Huh. Henry's tone betrayed a hint of disappointment. The two aging women were sharp as ever, their observational skills honed by decades of showbiz. Even without Henry saying much, they immediately picked up on the emotion behind his voice. Audrey chuckled warmly and said, "Don't worry, Henry. From the moment I saw you, the job was already yours, unless you don't want it." Beaming, Henry exclaimed, "How could I possibly say no to an opportunity like this? To serve Miss Hepburn is the honor of a lifetime." His whole demeanor screamed loyal puppy. Even the tongue he'd never wagged in his previous life now fully embraced its new, enthusiastic role. And yet, Henry was far from oblivious. He simply hummed silently to himself. Young men don't appreciate older women till they taste the sweetness of soft rice. But Audrey didn't smile at his instant agreement. Instead, she turned serious. "This job isn't going to be easy, Henry. Rather than calling it a driver role, I'd say it's more like being a personal assistant. The most important thing is that you'll be following me all over the world, most of the time in Europe." Anton, who worked for me since my Hollywood days, finally retired after my work as UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador became too taxing. I became an ambassador in 1988, and I've been traveling constantly for visits and charity events ever since. The job just became too much for him. That's why I need someone new. I want to be very clear, it's not just about driving. It's not insanely difficult, but it is extremely detail-heavy. Most of all, you'll need to accompany this old lady on all her travels. Are you still willing? Of course I am, ma'am. I have a knack for languages, too. Maybe I can be of some help, Henry replied before repeating the same sentence fluently in French, Dutch, and German. "I'm truly surprised," Audrey said, not hiding her astonishment. She turned to the older woman beside her. "Catherine, is this the little surprise you said you had for me?" Catherine, being a born-and-raised American, only spoke a bit of French, and not very fluently at that. By contrast, Audrey was a British citizen born in Belgium, with Dutch noble roots. She could speak several major European languages as if they were her native tongue. And the three languages Henry had just used were, coincidentally, Belgium's official languages. In truth, Catherine hadn't expected Henry to pull that stunt, but it didn't surprise her too much. Tony Sharptongue was ever ready to lash out at Henry, but he had never once called him stupid, which said quite a lot. So Catherine shook her head and replied, "That wasn't the surprise I was talking about. The reason I recommended this boy to be your driver is because of a particular gift he has." "A gift?" Audrey was intrigued and looked at the young man through the rearview mirror. Catherine continued, "Little Henry here is, well, bulletproof." "Bulletproof?" Audrey blinked. "Do you mean what I think you mean?" "I'm pretty sure it's exactly what you're thinking," Catherine said, miming a finger gun to her temple and pulling the trigger, then shaking her head in mock disdain. This time, Audrey Hepburn was truly stunned. People with special abilities weren't exactly common in the world, but for some mysterious reason, the world they lived in seemed relatively tolerant toward mutants and gifted individuals. So Audrey wasn't disgusted or afraid, just curious. She asked, "Henry, if you really have a gift like that, surely you could land a much better-paying job. I'm afraid I couldn't possibly offer a competitive salary." "Well, ladies," Henry replied with a tinge of helplessness, "think about it. What kind of person would be willing to pay a fortune to hire someone just to take bullets for them? Good people? Probably not. More likely, the worst kinds of people." Audrey and Catherine understood instantly. These weren't naive women raised in a greenhouse. They'd seen the world's darker corners. Henry said plainly, "I never intended to make a fortune off this ability. I don't even need to use it. What matters most to me is being able to work for you, Miss Hepburn. As for compensation, Treat me like any regular driver or assistant. I'd even be willing to pay you to let me do this job. So tell me, ma'am, how much should I pay to earn the chance to serve you? Oh, Henry, are you serious? That's so sweet of you, Audrey said, hand over her heart. Of course I am. The chance to work for a beautiful lady like you doesn't come to just anyone. Meanwhile, there are crooks everywhere who want someone to take a bullet for them, to make money from people like that. Well, I have to toss my conscience to the dogs. That's right, Audrey. Catherine chimed in with a rare hint of earnestness. Take this good boy with you. Your health is worse than mine, even though I'm 20 years older, and you still insist on running all over the place. Without someone reliable to look after you, how much longer do you think we'll have together? A perfectly timed assist, Catherine cut off any chance Audrey might have had to raise philosophical questions like Tony had earlier. Why not use your gift to help the world? Besides, all this traveling really had taken a toll on Audrey's health. She had reluctantly let go of the long-serving Anton. Not just because the man himself could no longer keep up, but because she had also noticed signs that he wasn't quite up to the task anymore. What she needed now was new blood to support her humanitarian efforts. In the end, Audrey Hepburn relented. All right then, Henry. Welcome aboard, she said with a warm smile. I'm just a faded star who's long since stepped away from the spotlight. I hope you won't be disappointed by the paycheck. Of course not, ma'am. Call me Audrey, she said playfully. Otherwise, if you're calling Catherine by her first name but still addressing me as Miss Hepburn, I'll get jealous. Was it some kind of natural skill that let women use jealousy as a form of charm? Henry had no defense against it. Not even Kryptonians were immune. Okay then, Audrey, Henry murmured sheepishly as he drove. Actually, I do have one little wish. Oh, please go on. Well, if it's not too much to ask, I'd really love an autographed photo from you, Henry admitted. I've scoured all of Hollywood. Can't even find pictures of either of you at souvenir shops or auctions. Catherine couldn't resist taking another jab. Who'd want photos of washed-up old ladies? It's no wonder you couldn't find any. Isn't it more likely, Henry countered smoothly, that the people who do have your signed photos treasure them so much that they'd never part with them? Oh heavens, Catherine, what's up with this boy? Audrey asked with mock exasperation, gently smacking Catherine's arm and clutching her chest. Well, I have to admit, anyone introduced by the Stark men is bound to be unreliable, father and son both. Maybe it's time you reconsidered your assistant choice. Hey now, ladies, Henry protested. I don't talk like this to just anyone, you know. Ah, yes, that familiar flavor, the two elder ladies said in unison, exchanging looks of mock suspicion before bursting into laughter. Feeling awkward under their scrutiny, Henry quickly changed the subject. So, shall we head over to the insurance manager now? No, Audrey replied. Our appointment is this afternoon, and it's nearly lunchtime. I think we should find somewhere to eat first. Any recommendations? I had nothing but toast and coffee on the plane. I'm starving. How about Italian? Henry offered. It's a small family-run restaurant owned by an Italian couple. I can't say if it's truly authentic. I've never been to Italy myself, but it's really good. Unless either of you had somewhere else in mind. The two older women glanced at each other. Audrey perked up. No, let's try that Italian place. Let's see if their cuisine is authentic enough for us to judge. Catherine added. Yes, I'm sick of people treating me like I'm too old to eat anything. Don't eat this. Don't eat that. I've had enough of it. Henry looked visibly embarrassed. He hadn't even thought about that. He was about to take it back, but seeing the two stars already deep in enthusiastic discussion about Italian food, he could only steer the car toward Mama Salia's restaurant. For the elderly, happiness is often more important than dietary restrictions. As expected, Aunt Salia's Italian cuisine was so delicious that it completely won over both movie legends. Audrey chatted happily with the proprietress in Italian, discussing not just the food, but everything under the sun. Henry acted as the interpreter, relaying the conversation to Catherine, who didn't understand a word of Italian, while also helping her chime in at the right moments. By the end of it, even without Henry translating, Catherine seemed to keep pace with their Italian chatter. She knew exactly when to laugh, when to react appropriately, almost like she understood the language herself. Henry observed that beyond the unspoken understanding between women, the real key was how much body language Italian uses in conversation. More than the words, it was the animated gestures that made it so expressive and apparently teachable by immersion alone. Catherine had quickly picked up on the rhythm, almost like a natural. After the meal, as per tradition, came the classic moment. The owner posing for Polaroids with the two stars. This was still the era when Polaroid cameras were all the rage. Most celebrities didn't mind taking a photo with one, since it lacked negatives, meaning the chances of it being altered or misused were practically zero. If the photo was damaged or lost, it was gone for good. That uniqueness made each Polaroid shot feel precious. So, both Hepburn ladies took individual photos with the restaurant's owners, even leaving a few handwritten notes. That kind of Polaroid charm was something the younger generation, raised in the age of digital photography, could never fully appreciate. Once their bellies were full, Henry drove the two ladies toward downtown Los Angeles. The Ronnie Insurance Brokerage was located on one of the upper floors of a commercial office building. But not just anyone could walk into this building, press the elevator button, and ride up freely. There was a front desk and security personnel in the lobby who were very strict about screening visitors. If you weren't a building tenant, you'd better have an appointment. Fortunately, the arrival of the two Hepburn ladies wasn't met with any pushback. That's because Mr. Wales Ronnie himself was waiting downstairs in the lobby to greet them personally. He was a distinguished older gentleman, likely not even younger than Audrey. His broad frame and impeccably tailored suit made it clear. This was an old-school professional through and through. He and Audrey were clearly longtime acquaintances. As soon as they met, they exchanged air kisses. "Miss Hepburn," Mr. Ronnie said warmly, "it's an honor to serve you again. Little Wales, you won't turn me away unannounced, will you?" Catherine stepped forward a moment later, also exchanging a kiss on the cheek. "Ah, another Miss Hepburn," Ronnie chuckled. "I couldn't welcome you too fast enough. There's no way I'd turn you away." Then he noticed the young man standing just behind the two stars. "And this gentleman is—" "This is Henry," Audrey explained, "my newly hired assistant." Henry took the cue perfectly. From the paper bag he carried, he pulled out a bottle of champagne tied with a red ribbon and offered it with both hands. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ronnie. A small token from the two Miss Hepburns." "How thoughtful," Ronnie replied, taking the bottle and placing it carefully back in the bag. "Now please this way. The security team I wanted to introduce is already waiting in my office." With Mr. Ronnie leading the way, the lobby security guards didn't dare stop them. Instead, they respectfully pressed the elevator button and held the door open until everyone stepped inside. As was customary in high-end American businesses, no matter how messy their private lives might be, professionals always had a well-appointed reception space to meet clients. That's where the Hepburn ladies were led, into a cozy and meticulously arranged meeting lounge. Inside were already 4 burly men standing at attention. Though both Hepburns were long past their youthful prime, they hadn't faded entirely from the spotlight. Even if they weren't the radiant beauties of their heyday, they were still recognizable to many. These men, well-built and professional, clearly knew who they were there to meet. As soon as Audrey walked into the room, they all rose from their seats in greeting. Even if she hadn't been their employer, it was still proper, gentlemanly etiquette to rise when a lady entered the room. Ronnie made the introductions. "Miss Hepburn, this is the security team I wanted you to meet. The team lead is Brian Mills. These gentlemen are Sam Gilroy, Mark Cassie, and Bernie Harris." Audrey shook hands with each of them. They're all former U.S. Army Special Forces Green Berets. Now, they run their own private security company specializing in VIP protection. Although their company is newly established, I personally contacted their commanding officers from their military service, and every reference spoke highly of them. All of them have been deployed overseas more than twice and were honorably discharged. Their only drawback is that they don't take on long-term assignments. But that actually suits your trip to Somalia, Audrey. They'll be responsible for your safety throughout your visit, until you return to the civilized world. Audrey frowned slightly. "But I'm only going as a UNICEF ambassador to inspect local child aid programs, conduct evaluations, and take some photos to help with fundraising. Is all this really necessary? Brian Mills stepped forward then. His years in the military had stripped away all signs of youth, leaving him with sharp, angular features and piercing eyes that exuded authority. With a deep, resonant voice that seemed to echo, he said, "Ma'am, we too wish this world were safe and peaceful. But it isn't. The insurance company's recommendation is simply an extra measure to ensure your safety." An insurance company recommended this team? Catherine raised a brow and asked, "Wales, I thought you were the one who found these boys." Ronnie explained, "Catherine, I always put my clients' interests first. I inquired with several insurance companies and selected the provider that offered the most favorable terms. In this case, Pacific Mutual not only gave the best premium, but also proactively offered a professional security team to ensure everything goes smoothly. That's why these fine gentlemen are here. But make no mistake, their credentials and reputations were all personally vetted by me. I don't just pass along whatever an insurance company says. These men are trustworthy. I guarantee it. This was an era when America had just concluded the First Gulf War. With the reunification of Germany and the collapse of the Northern Red Empire looming, U.S. soldiers of the time were basking in their sense of invincibility, utterly convinced that no one in the world could match their might. Even if these soldiers hadn't personally taken part in that war, simply using the same equipment gave the impression that they could have. And honestly, that wasn't entirely an illusion. It was more or less true. Even after discharge, a soldier's habits didn't just fade away from a few months of civilian life. That said, Brian and his team didn't exude any aggressive sharpness. Instead, they were calm and restrained. To two veteran actresses who had seen all kinds of people in their lives, this kind of demeanor earned them a few extra points. After all, someone who remains composed and steady under pressure is far more trustworthy than some hot-blooded rookie who charges in without thinking. The latter is far more likely to mess things up. Even so, Audrey didn't give her trust lightly. After sitting down, she pulled a folder from her handbag and slid it across the table. "This is the itinerary drafted by the UNICEF team," she said. "Take a look and let me know how your team could provide support for each location, or if there are any parts that might require adjustments. I'd appreciate a brief overview of your approach." Neither of the Hepburn ladies were strangers to security teams, whether bodyguards or security escorts from film crews during cross-country publicity tours. So Audrey used this itinerary as a test. Even if she didn't have professional training, after years of being the one under protection, she had developed a keen sense for who was capable and who wasn't. If all the team did was stand around stiff as statues, their effectiveness would be questionable at best. Fortunately, Brian Mills was an organized and thorough man. As he read through the schedule provided by the UN, he began explaining how his team would coordinate for each leg of the trip and what kind of deployment they would use. He also pointed out gaps in the original plan and made suggestions for adjustments. Each explained clearly, item by item. To the non-experts in the room, Brian sounded very competent, like someone who genuinely knew what he was talking about. Naturally, Audrey couldn't find any faults in Brian's assessment or corrections. She said, "Mr. Mills, could you organize everything you just mentioned into a proper proposal? You understand, we'll need to justify any itinerary changes to UNICEF with clear reasons. It can't be some last-minute demand forcing others to accommodate us." Brian Mills allowed himself a rare, somewhat shy smile. "I suppose it means we've got the job?" "Of course. Welcome aboard," Audrey said, rising from her seat to shake his hand. Brian added, "In that case, may I keep a copy of this itinerary for reference while I prepare the plan?" "Of course. It's not a classified document," Audrey replied. Immediately, one of the office assistants stepped forward and took the folder to be copied. "I do apologize," Audrey added, "but time is tight. There aren't many days left before departure, so I'm afraid I'll have to ask your team to move quickly." "We understand," Brian nodded. "How should we send over the proposal once it's ready?" "Please hand it off to my new assistant, Henry Brown," Audrey replied. Henry hadn't sat down with the rest. Instead, he had been standing silently behind the two ladies. Upon hearing his name, he nodded in acknowledgement. Audrey turned back to him with a question. "Henry, do you have a fax machine?" "I only have an answering machine." If I need to use a fax, I'll have to apply for a second phone line first. In this era, when the internet was still just emerging and email barely existed, fax and postal mail were the main means of transmitting documents. Fax machines were easy enough to buy at any appliance store, but to avoid clashing with the home phone line, you'd have to request a separate line, something that required scheduling installation with the phone company. So Audrey turned to her insurance broker and asked, "Wales, may I borrow your fax line?" "Of course, Mississippi." Then, "Mr. Mills," Brian quickly interjected, "please, just call me Brian." "All right, Brian. Then please call me Audrey," she smiled. "If you need to send over any documents, fax them to Mr. Ronnie here. If you need to schedule a meeting, contact Henry." Henry jotted down a number by hand and passed it along. "Apologies, I don't have business cards yet." From a background actor to personal assistant of a global star, the leap was considerable. Henry hadn't had time to update all the trappings that came with his new identity. Luckily, Brian wasn't a stickler. Taking the number, he asked, "And how many people will be in the travel party?" "I'll need to know exactly who we're responsible for." Audrey replied, "UNICEF will send peacekeeping personnel for their own delegation. You'll mainly be responsible for me and my assistant, Henry." While that bulletproof young man technically didn't need protection, Audrey had no intention of broadcasting that fact. Henry himself had asked her not to go around announcing it. And in her understanding, Henry was only bullet-resistant. If he were left behind or outnumbered, he'd still be in danger. Brian's gaze then fell upon the other star in the room, Catherine. Sensing it, she waved him off with a chuckle. "Oh, please. You don't think an 80-something-year-old woman is about to haul herself off to Africa, do you? Leave the dark continent adventures to you young folks. I came today just to tag along, to see what kind of people you all were. If you want to protect Audrey, don't send us some puffed-up rookies." "And do we pass?" Brian asked with a nervous smile. "Miss Hepburn." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Which Miss Hepburn are you asking?" The two unrelated but now inseparable Hepburns burst out laughing. And it was then that Brian Mills finally showed his youthful side. He blushed and scratched his head, a little embarrassed. His teammates, of course, didn't let him off easy. They started teasing him on the spot. Thankfully, they still remembered they were in someone else's office, and in front of ladies, no less, so the teasing didn't get too wild. But they did mess up Brian's carefully combed hair, leaving him looking rather disheveled. The two Hepburn ladies were now laughing even harder. Hotels in Africa weren't exactly five-star getaways. No central air conditioning, no modern luxuries. If you were lucky, your room might come with a rickety electric fan that sounded like it might give out at any minute. Otherwise, you'd be left at the mercy of mosquitoes, windows wide open in the desperate hope of catching a breeze. And when the breeze did come, it was usually just more hot air. Henry's accommodations were no different from Audrey Hepburn's. Each had their own modest single room. The only exception was that, as her assistant, Henry's room was directly next to hers, for convenience and quick access. But he wasn't staying up in the night because of the heat or jet lag. No, Henry was up late, writing reports. See, just because it was a UN-sponsored charity trip didn't mean Audrey could show up, snap a few photos, and call it a day. Every visit had to be carefully documented. Notes, observations, photos as evidence. And once the whole trip was complete, there needed to be a formal report summarizing everything. The condition of children's aid organizations, education efforts, living standards, everything. That report would be key in persuading donors to open their wallets. In the past, Audrey wrote those reports herself, with the UNICEF photographer providing the visual material. But now that Henry was officially her assistant, he'd taken on the drafting work, handing her polished first drafts for revision. That alone saved her hours of labor, something her former assistant Anton, lovely as he was, had never been able to do. The old typewriter Audrey had brought along? It was now collecting dust in Henry's room. Yes, Henry had basically retired it. Or, more accurately, he used it sparingly. He'd opted for handwritten drafts instead, mostly to accommodate Audrey's worsening eyesight. A typewriter couldn't enlarge font size like a computer could. So Henry simply wrote everything in clean, clear block letters, big enough for her to read without needing reading glasses. And to be honest, writing by hand was faster. With his Kryptonian speed, Henry could fill pages in moments, far quicker than the mechanical pace of a typewriter hammering out each letter. Trying to use super speed on the typewriter only resulted in the poor machine jamming, smoking, and its arms getting tangled like spaghetti. So yeah, pen and paper it was. As long as he didn't accidentally punch a hole through the page, it worked just fine. As for the content, that was easy. After reading a few of Audrey's past reports, Henry had a template down pat. All he had to do was plug in the new info, adjust for the news site, and voila, instant report. This wasn't creative writing. There was no need for foreshadowing, suspense, flashbacks, or any literary gymnastics. These were government-style documents. The structure was rigid, the tone dry, and every paragraph needed to say exactly what it meant. Nothing more, nothing less. For someone who grew up under the grind of exam prep, Henry could write this stuff in his sleep. No need for superintelligence or deep thought. Just crank it out like a machine. Years of soul-crushing 996-word culture had made him a natural. And Audrey noticed. Quickly. With Henry doing the heavy lifting, she could actually sleep at night, assuming she could tolerate the oppressive heat, that is. Even photography had become his job. Audrey provided the camera, film, and developing materials, and Henry handled the rest. So during the day, you'd often see her assistant zipping around with a camera hanging from his neck, snapping photos from every possible angle. At night, he'd set up a darkroom in his hotel room using blackout curtains and develop the pictures himself. No red lights needed. Thank you very much. Kryptonian vision made working in the dark a non-issue. By the next morning, he'd already have contact sheets ready, sitting down with Audrey to review the photos and finalize the report content. The end result? Audrey had significantly more energy to focus on what mattered. Her workload was lighter, her stress reduced. Henry might not have had prior assistant experience, but between his eidetic memory, near-limitless stamina, and powered-up productivity, he had basically turned himself into a one-man 007. And the wild part? He didn't even mind. Sure, his boss wasn't some hot young starlet. Audrey was decades past her silver screen prime. But those soulful, intelligent eyes of hers, they had only grown more profound with time. Her voice still carried that same gentle warmth he remembered from her films. And her kindness, genuine, thoughtful, radiant, was utterly disarming. Before all this, Henry had always rolled his eyes at people labeled saints. He thought the term was just another virtue-signaling mask for hypocrisy. In his experience, most so-called saints were full of contradictions, preaching kindness while lacing their actions with ego and self-righteousness. The moment you challenged their logic, they'd either lash out or fall apart. But Audrey, she was different. She wasn't just playing a role. She'd earned everything: the goodwill, the admiration, the legacy, through years of quiet, tireless service. Of course, it helped that she was financially comfortable. It's easier to be selfless when your own needs are met. As the old saying went, when in poverty, focus on your own virtue. When in prosperity, aid the world. Audrey Hepburn had clearly entered the second phase. She wasn't just some idealist crying over sad stories. She felt every tragedy she witnessed, genuinely grieved for the children, cried when she saw suffering, laughed with joy when they smiled. It was honest, pure. The rest of the team? Not so much. Let's just say the UN delegation was a mixed bag. There's a reason they say diplomats are half spies. Behind every charitable mission, there's almost always another agenda. Henry kept his opinions to himself, but he saw the signs. These so-called humanitarian observers were all juggling side tasks that had nothing to do with education or aid. And as for the security team that the insurance company had recommended, yeah, not as squeaky clean as they looked either. Audrey had reluctantly agreed to allow them to carry weapons, thinking it was standard protocol, maybe some handguns for emergencies. But what Henry saw with his X-ray vision, light machine guns, grenades, landmines, stuff that had no place in a personal security detail. Not that he could call them out. How would he even explain knowing? Telling Audrey would only put her in a tougher spot. In a way, Her fame was the only thing keeping the wolves at bay. So Henry stayed quiet. He played the role. Assistant, photographer, ghostwriter, bodyguard, whatever was needed. Because in a world full of shadows and lies, Audrey Hepburn's light was worth protecting. Henry didn't believe for a second that Brian Mills and his so-called security team had any designs on a retired movie star. No, their interest in Audrey Hepburn had nothing to do with her celebrity status. It was more likely that she was the perfect cover. Just like those diplomatic UN staffers, they were using her as a human shield while carrying out their real mission. And when it came to shady American agencies pulling strings abroad, you didn't need to guess. 3 letters practically flashed in neon. CIA. The entire visiting delegation in Somalia, besides Henry and Audrey herself, was basically a traveling circus of ulterior motives. It was like someone had dropped a Halloween party into a war zone. Spies, agents, double dealers, pick your poison. And tonight, while Henry sat alone in his sweltering room working on reports, his Kryptonian vision and super hearing kept tabs on the others. Audrey, predictably, had gone to bed early, but the rest of the crew, very much awake. One was on a shortwave radio, tapping out coded transmissions. Another was oiling and inspecting weapons. A third was having a hushed conversation with a local warlord right outside the compound walls. No, Henry wasn't arrogant enough to think he just happened to walk into the one visit where all this was going down. He figured every one of Audrey's missions had this crap happening behind the scenes. It's just that, until now, nothing had exploded. No scandals. No collateral damage. So it all stayed hidden. In fact, keeping Audrey's image clean and saintly was in everyone's best interest. If the public ever caught wind that her goodwill tours were a smokescreen for covert ops, the backlash would be devastating. And then what? No more cover. No more protection. No more missions. So Henry didn't interfere. As long as his employer was safe, he saw no reason to shatter her idealistic worldview. Let her live in the fairy tale. Let her keep doing the work she loved. He'd protect that dream, no matter how rotten the world around it might be. Still, he was curious. With all these people crawling around under his metaphorical nose, how could he not peek? A little X-ray vision here, a little eavesdropping there. It wasn't like he was spying. He was monitoring. Okay, fine, he was snooping. He got into the habit of scanning through their briefcases, documents, and gear whenever things got slow. Eventually, he got so good at it, he could flip through papers with his eyes like a speed reader, without ever leaving his seat. The contents? As expected, communications with Somali warlords, plans to destabilize the current regime, diagrams of troop movements and equipment inventories, assessments of firepower, mechanization levels, everything you'd need to engineer a coup. The target? President Mohammed Syed Barre, a dictator hanging on a power by a thread. Henry wasn't sure whether the plan was to hand the data to the president as a test of loyalty or to one of the factions plotting to overthrow him. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the CIA had something bigger in mind. It was impossible to say, but it all smelled familiar. The same old vultures circling the same broken nations. Superheroes or not, the world hadn't gotten any cleaner. Powers had changed, faces had changed, but the game? Still the same. If anything, it had gotten worse. In Henry's old world, before the powers, before the Second Life, he'd seen how even medicine or data could be turned into weapons. Anything could become a tool for domination. The sharper the tool, the more devastating the result. The real question was always, who's holding the blade? Henry didn't try to stop them. It wasn't his war, not his country, not his fight. This was a world with mutants, with Captain America, with Tony Stark. It already had heroes. Henry wasn't one of them, not by his own reckoning, anyway. After 20 years of being imprisoned, 20 years of silence, isolation, and a life half erased, he'd learned how to avoid the pressure points that might make him snap. Because he knew himself. He knew that once he crossed that line, there would be no going back. If he ever gave in to the darkness, let himself truly unleash the power of a Kryptonian without restraint, the ending would only go one of two ways. Either the world would break, or he would. Of course, there was always the third option, The fan-favorite fantasy ending where he became so powerful, he ruled the multiverse itself. Life, death, reality bent to his will. A cosmic puppet master playing God. But that kind of godhood required a kind of detachment Henry didn't want. Not really, because what stops someone from falling into the abyss isn't power. It's anchor points, a reason to hold back, a place to return to, a home. Without a home, it's easy to go full villain, even easier to justify it, because once you start, every step forward burns the bridge behind you. Even if you wanted to stop, you couldn't, because the consequences of turning back would swallow you whole. And that's the kind of person who scares the hell out of the world, someone with nothing to lose. For Henry, watching black and white films on a dusty old TV in Alaska had once been his way of staying sane. Those classic images, those performances, they'd kept the shadows at bay. But serving Audrey Hepburn, the woman now sleeping peacefully in the room next door, had become something far more powerful. She was his anchor. No one knew the full truth of Henry's past. He hadn't told anyone. But some people, Audrey and Catherine included, were perceptive enough to sense it. And they responded not with suspicion, but kindness. They treated him like a kid, not in a patronizing way, more like an adopted family member. Catherine had no children of her own. Audrey did. Maybe that's why the way she looked at Henry wasn't like a boss or even a friend. It was like she was looking at a son she hadn't seen in years. Henry had no illusions. He wasn't looking for a mother, and he definitely didn't have any twisted feelings for a 60-year-old retired actress. But he couldn't deny the warmth that came from being seen, cared for, remembered. Like maybe, just maybe, he belonged somewhere in this crazy world. And if anyone tried to take that from him, he might just break his own rules. Not to the point of bloodshed, no. Not unless it became absolutely necessary. But if someone did endanger Audrey, well, he wouldn't just sit by and watch. Because this wasn't his world, and he wasn't its Superman. That cape, that burden, he never wanted it. But he'd be damned if he let her light get snuffed out by some government spook chasing power plays. Outside, the stillness of night was broken by a distant dog barking. The warm breeze carried with it the scent of dust, heat, and tension. This was Henry's first time stepping foot on the African continent. He didn't feel particularly moved. The wind was still wind. The heat didn't bother him. The bugs couldn't bite through Kryptonian skin. But the darkness? That never slept. Henry sat there in silence, watching, waiting. And as long as the storm didn't come for him or the woman in the next room, he'd let it rage on. Hey, buddy, want a cold one? Henry leaned on the back of the truck, pressing down on the lid of a styrofoam cooler packed with ice. He looked over at Bernie, the oldest member of the security team. The retired Green Beret glanced at his teammate Mark, then nodded. Sure, Henry. Crack one open. Henry pulled out 2 ice-cold cans of beer and tossed them over with practiced ease. Then he grabbed one for himself. Crack. All 3 popped their tabs at once, took a long pull, and exhaled in unison. The chilled beer felt like liquid magic, driving the African heat from their bones. Not far away, Audrey Hepburn was playing with the children at the local shelter, accompanied by UN staff and a few Somali officials. At least she was. The others had already stepped aside after the photo op, deep in conversation, their expressions clouded with concern. Henry, thanks to his super hearing, had already caught wind of the topic. Unrest in the region, instability, tension. The kind of thing you didn't see in press releases, only in the furrow of brows and tight whispers. The only time they really smiled at the kids was when someone raised a camera. At that point, their warmth could rival a summer's day. Henry had just finished shooting a roll of film and returned to the car to reload. He took the chance to hang back, sip a beer, and catch a breather with the 2 private security guys. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a few local uniformed men, police or soldiers, hard to say, looking their way with clear envy in their eyes. Henry grabbed a few more beers from the cooler and walked over, greeting them in broken Somali. Hey friends, hot day, huh? How about a little gift from a friend? One of the men grinned wide and replied, You are too kind, my friend. They accepted the beer with delight. Henry had picked up a little Somali before the trip, but it hadn't come easy. Textbook language and real-life conversation were 2 completely different beasts. The first few days, his robotic phrasing got him laughed at. But he kept trying. And over time, the jokes turned into camaraderie. Of course, if he wanted to, he could mimic their dialect and accent perfectly, right down to the rolling consonants and local cadence. But that would have been suspiciously impressive. So he played dumb and learned slow. Back by the car, Henry turned to Bernie. "Where's Brian and the rest?" Bernie grunted. "They're working on tomorrow's arrangements." Henry let out a sigh. "Figures." Before we left, everyone kept insisting no sudden plan changes. But the second we land, boom, chaos. Bernie chuckled wryly. Nobody saw things getting this bad. We figured it'd be a walk in the park, tour a few spots, snap some photos, and go home. Henry raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He didn't believe that for a second. If anything, it was the meddling of Bernie and his CIA buddies that helped stir the pot here in the first place. But of course, he couldn't say that. So instead, he went along. From what I've heard, Somalia invited us over. But once we got here, whole country's spiraling, and there wasn't a word of that in any report. He cracked another grin. I'm starting to think President Barr didn't ask for more aid money. He was trying to lure in UN peacekeepers to prop up his crumbling regime. Bernie nodded grimly. You're not wrong. We've known these damn Africans for a long time. No wonder the old plantation owners just used the whip instead of trying to negotiate. Henry didn't react. This wasn't the kind of world where you could call out that kind of blatant racism and expect it to change anything. Not in the early 90s. Back home in the States, political correctness hadn't tightened its grip yet. People like Bernie could say whatever they wanted, and they often did. Even in the future, that kind of hate didn't vanish. It just got better at hiding. Henry sighed and changed the subject. And now we're supposed to visit a site that's already in the middle of a civil flare-up? The Somalis say Audrey doesn't have to go if she doesn't want to, but they're insisting the peacekeepers do. He laughed dryly. The way that guy made the request, with his nose in the air, I almost laughed out loud. You seriously think we're just his personal army? Bernie grinned. Nose in the air? You mean those big-ass nostrils of his? I don't think he can look down. Thanks to him, we've got to split the team and send people in two directions, Henry said with a groan. Honestly, I'd rather just tell Miss Hepburn to call it and head home early. Bernie shook his head. You and me both, kid. But nobody can talk that woman out of something once she's made up her mind. Hell, even Brian just shrugged and started reworking the plan. Henry gave him a look. You've seen movies, right? You know how it goes. As soon as the team splits up, one group gets screwed. Worst case scenario, full wipe. Always happens. Hollywood logic. Bernie laughed again. This is real life, Henry. We don't follow scriptwriting rules. No commander with half a brain splits forces unless he's got a solid plan. And Brian's got one. He went on. We're not going in blind. Tomorrow's site was already listed as a backup in the original itinerary. Brian's just shifting deployments and locking down the area in advance. You'll be safe. That's our job. Henry muttered something under his breath, just loud enough to sound like the grumbling of a slightly nervous young assistant. Then Audrey waved from across the lot. Henry straightened up and grabbed a crate of candy and biscuits from the back of the truck. She's calling me. Gotta go. Go on, kid, Bernie chuckled. I've got your ass covered. The others laughed. Henry rolled his eyes. He didn't dislike these covert CIA boys masquerading as security. In fact, he kind of liked them. They were too rough around the edges to last in the intelligence game for long. They'd probably end up back in some war zone, or in a body bag, before they got used to the stench of real espionage. Still, he shot back with a smirk. Then if some psycho charges in here with a rocket launcher pointed at my ass, make sure you block it with your mouth. That way we don't all have to worry about yours later. Oh damn, Mark finally spoke up, whistling. Kid's got bite. I still can't believe this is really happening, Henry said, leaning back in his seat and staring out the window of the private jet. Blue skies, white clouds. It looked like a painting. Sure, the aircraft wasn't one of those ultra-luxurious Gulfstreams, but it was a far cry from some rattling old propeller plane. Comfortable enough to make you forget you were flying into chaos. Across from him, Brian Mills, the head of their security detail, stretched his legs and said, "Count your blessings. The place we're headed actually has a proper cement runway. If it didn't, we'd be bouncing around in a prop plane, and trust me, you'd feel every damn bump like you were on a roller coaster from hell. Henry gave him a sidelong look. Do I strike you as the kind of guy who gets on a plane and starts giggling like a kid on his first trip to Disneyland? No. What's blowing my mind is how the UN staff are acting like they're on strings pulled by President Barr of Somalia. They said we wouldn't change the itinerary, and by God, we're sticking to it, no matter how bad things get. They even sent a whole unit of peacekeepers to escort the other group. And let's be honest, sending in that squad is more about optics than protection. I'm not saying those guys are useless, but there's only so many you can spare. If anything goes wrong, all they can do is throw themselves between the UN and a bad day. Brian didn't reply. He didn't have to. Henry's rant wasn't aimed at him. And that dictator, Henry added, he probably thinks we're going to swoop in like superheroes and clean up his civil war for him. Might as well hand us Qurans and call us prophets. What Henry didn't say out loud was the thought nagging in the back of his head. Maybe the real reason Somalia is descending into chaos is because of us, because we're here. There were 8 people on board. Audrey Hepburn, Henry, Brian's 4-man team, a lone female flight attendant, and the pilot tucked away in the cockpit. With such a small group, Brian had opted to charter a small private jet. The UN picked up the tab. The destination airport was already briefed with rental cars and a local official waiting. Henry glanced around and asked, "So who exactly decided we're going here?" Across the cabin, Audrey glanced up from her seat, a soft smile tugging at her lips. She didn't call him out, but if she hadn't already known about Henry's invulnerability, she might have believed he was actually nervous. He played the timid assistant well. Still, she played along. It was a group decision. We chose a location in the southern region of Somalia, furthest from the northern conflict zones. We figured distance equals safety. Henry scoffed silently. That kind of logic was exactly the problem. These people still thought the world worked on old rules. That if you kept the trouble isolated, it would just stay put. No one wanted to accept that chaos had a way of spreading like wildfire. In truth, no one had learned the lessons that would come years later with the Arab Spring. They were still living in a fantasy where American military might solve everything. Henry, of course, had no authority to change plans. Hell, he didn't even have the right to suggest alternatives. He could only drop hints to Audrey in private or quietly grumble to himself. But in the end, she was the employer. He was just a help. As the plane began its descent, they passed through thick clouds, revealing a wide swath of African savanna below. The view stretched out endlessly, golden and wild. Henry's enhanced vision zoomed in, catching sight of a massive herd of zebras running across the plains. He blinked, then said with disbelief, "We're supposed to find a children's center out here." Brian explained, "We'll be landing at a small airstrip. From there, it's about a half-day drive to a village. That's where the UN has a children's aid facility." Bernie, the team's grizzled old vet, added, "Officially, it's for housing and caring for orphan children. But where the funding actually goes, let's just say the books are probably more fiction than fact." Brian shot him a glare. Audrey wasn't exactly thrilled by that kind of cynicism. Bernie caught the look and added, "Still, the place is legit. Clean, organized, actually better than most. That's why it made the short list and eventually became our fallback site." As they chatted, the plane touched down smoothly. The Italian pilot handled the landing like a pro, hardly a bump. The airstrip was a small, open-air one. It had staff, sure, but animals could be seen meandering across the tarmac like it was just another trail. Once the plane taxied to a stop, 2 unattended Land Rover Range Rovers sat nearby, waiting. Brian and his men were the first out. They formed a loose semicircle at the base of the stairs, eyes scanning the surroundings in practiced sync. Henry followed soon after, pausing only to offer his arm to Audrey as she stepped down. Henry gestured to the nearby SUVs. "Are those ours?" Sam and Mark moved in to check the vehicles. Brian answered, "I looked into the terrain before we left. The roads out there are practically non-existent, more like trails through grassland. A standard sedan wouldn't last 10 minutes. He motioned toward the vehicles. "For this kind of ground, off-roaders are the only way to go. But if we want any comfort at all, an SUV is the best compromise. These ranges are as good as it gets out here. Henry raised a brow. Nice vehicles. Must have had CIA strings pulled somewhere to get these on standby. He didn't say it out loud. No point drawing attention to their Black Ops sugar daddies. Brian turned back to Audrey. Apologies for the bumpy ride ahead, ma'am. These next couple of days won't exactly be luxury travel. Audrey smiled gently. No need to apologize. I've ridden in worse. Compared to some of the off-road vehicles I've seen, a Range Rover feels downright civilized. Henry dragged a folding chair into the shade beneath the aircraft hangar and set it down with a courteous smile. Boss, we've got a decent load of supplies to haul off the plane. It'll take a bit. Why don't you rest here for a while? Audrey Hepburn gave him a mild glare. I've been sitting on that plane for hours, and now you want me to sit some more? She brushed him off with a smile. Go on, sweetheart. I'll take a walk, stretch my legs. If I get tired, I'll sit on my own. Henry relented with a sigh. All right, boss. Just don't want her off too far. We like to keep eyes on you. The rest of the team rolled up their sleeves and got to work unloading the cargo they brought with them. Unlike a commercial airliner, their jet didn't have a designated cargo hold. The supplies had been packed into storage compartments or strapped directly to the floor of the cabin. There was a lot to move. Henry, Brian called, pointing toward a stack of taped-up cardboard boxes. Grab those and start loading up. On it, Henry and Bernie tackled the boxes. Relief supplies collected for the children's shelter. Mostly food, clothing, and some well-meaning but completely impractical stuffed toys. They also had their own survival kits, bottled water, dry rations, sleeping bags, basic essentials. Brian and the others, meanwhile, were moving heavier crates and metal cases, the kind of supplies they didn't want Henry anywhere near. Ammunition, maintenance kits, and a few things that fell under the don't ask unless you want plausible deniability revoked category. For the sake of discretion, the team kept their weapons tucked away. No assault rifles on full display. The last thing they wanted was to terrify the children they were supposedly here to help. In a place like this, guns weren't just objects, they were trauma incarnate. Many of the kids in these shelters had lost their families to the barrel of a rifle. Audrey had been firm about this before they even left Europe. No long guns visible around the children. Once everything was loaded into the two waiting vehicles, Henry turned to watch their Italian pilot taxi the jet carefully into the shade of the hangar. One of the airport staff came by, casually collected the hangar fee, and strolled off with all the urgency of someone on island time. With everything prepped and packed, the group remained at the airfield, waiting for their local contact and guide to arrive. Wandering off into a rural region of Somalia without a liaison would be a bad idea, especially when the locals weren't expecting a convoy of white foreigners. As they waited, Henry turned to Brian. So, what's the plan from here? Brian nodded. This place doesn't have night landing capabilities. Even if we leave for the village right now and haul ass back, we'd miss the cutoff and get grounded here overnight. So we're stuck here? Henry asked. Yep, we're spending the night one way or another, where it depends on what the local officials arrange. I brought camping gear just in case. Worst comes to worst, we sleep under the stars. Henry gestured toward the plane. And what about the pilot and the flight attendant? They sticking around? They'll stay at the airfield, Brian replied. Clean the cabin, do a maintenance sweep. And let's be honest, this isn't exactly the kind of place where you can grab a drink at a bar after work. If they try to stay in a local inn, they'll probably end up missing the plane. Comfort-wise, the jet's better than anything they'll find here. He gave Henry a pointed look. Also, if they stay with the plane, they can keep an eye on it. You leave a jet out here unguarded. Next thing you know, every bolt and panel's gone missing. Locals treat aircraft like a buffet of spare parts. Seriously? Henry raised a brow. Brian chuckled, gesturing at the open surroundings. See any fences? Barbed wire? Security guards? Hell, look at the hangars. Any plane inside? There's always someone next to it. Watchdogs with rifles, or just mechanics coincidentally hanging around. He shrugged. It's Africa, kid. Anything can happen. That's why I insisted on bringing firepower. Hopefully we don't need it. But if we do, better to have it and not need it than the other way around. The last part was aimed at Audrey. Back before the trip began, she'd objected to Brian's team carrying weapons. In her eyes, this was a humanitarian mission, just visiting children. What possible use were guns? But when even the UN showed up with armed peacekeepers, she'd reluctantly relented. Her only condition: don't wave the guns around in front of the kids. They waited for a good while before their local contacts finally arrived. 2 Somali men, one heavy-set and one lean and wiry. The big guy was dressed in a loose linen t-shirt and slacks, surprisingly upscale for the region. The thin one, meanwhile, looked like he could snap a man in half with his biceps. Clad in a tight camo shirt and worn jeans, he had the energy of a guy who didn't need a gun to make you hand over your wallet. The two started arguing in rapid Somali, their tone just shy of a full-blown shouting match. Eventually, the heavier man stepped forward and addressed them in halting English. "You are UN visitors, yes? Miss Hepburn's group? I'm your liaison. This is your guide." Audrey stepped forward with a diplomatic smile and extended her hand. As she shook hands with the official, Henry instinctively lifted his camera and started snapping shots. Politicians loved photos that made them look useful. But Henry noticed something odd. The man seemed uneasy with the camera. Not the usual, don't catch my bad side, kind of discomfort. More like he didn't want his face documented at all. Still, no one pressed the issue. The man hurried them along. "Please, we go now. The drive is long." Everyone loaded up without protest. The 2 Somalis took the lead in a battered Jeep. Henry took the wheel of one of the Range Rovers, with Bernie in the passenger seat. Audrey and Brian sat in the back. The second vehicle had Mark driving, Sam riding shotgun, and the rest of the cargo crammed in the back seat. Stuff that didn't quite fit in the trunk. Without any more delay, the convoy rolled out of the dusty airstrip and onto the open plains. Mark had no trouble keeping pace with the erratic Jeep. The real question mark was Henry. Brian kept a watchful eye from the back seat. But after a few minutes, it was clear Henry could handle himself. He held formation perfectly, 3 car lengths behind the lead vehicle, wheels falling exactly into the same ruts. Not bad at all, especially for someone driving on makeshift trails. Still, something nagged at Brian. He knew Henry could speak Somali, had heard it himself just days ago. Henry had even gone out his way to befriend local soldiers, guides, and airport staff. But today he was oddly quiet. No effort to chat. No showing off his language skills. He wasn't even pretending to understand. Maybe others would write it off as embarrassment over his rusty grammar. But Brian trusted his gut. And his gut was almost never wrong, especially when it came to trouble. Brian didn't ask the question on his mind. Not right away. He noticed it too. Audrey Hepburn's young assistant was subtly, but deliberately, keeping anything ugly or unsettling well away from the woman's line of sight. And bringing things up now without proof, that would only cause unnecessary worry. Brian trusted that this sharp young man knew the boundaries. When the time came, he'd talk. That wasn't blind faith. It came from watching him. Everything Henry did was calculated, yet natural, always hitting the right note. That level of self-control didn't come from luck. So, Brian kept his eyes on the road, scanning the terrain, watching for any unfamiliar vehicles that might be tailing them, and checking in with the car behind them via radio to make sure all was quiet. Henry, meanwhile, was playing the part of a chatty young man perfectly, nudging old Bernie into storytelling mode. Some military tales were classified, of course, but a man who'd worn the Green Beret for decades? He had enough bizarre stories and embarrassing memories to last a lifetime. Henry leaned in, eyes wide like a clueless civilian, hanging on to every ridiculous anecdote. Even Audrey, riding in the back seat, was laughing out loud, completely charmed. She kept asking for more, like a curious child listening to bedtime stories. With 2 eager listeners cheering him on, Bernie got bolder. He gleefully sold out Mark and Sam, who weren't even in the car to defend themselves, recounting their early rookie screw-ups with glee. Using a toothbrush to scrub a toilet, and then using it again to brush your teeth? That was nothing. Emergency midnight drills where recruits showed up half-dressed. Someone brought a folding chair in full workout gear. Another arrived in full camo, gripping a wash basin instead of a rifle. Now that was the real entertainment. Even Brian, sitting up front, couldn't help but wince a little. If Bernie had this much dirt on the others, what stories did he have about him? Time passed quickly, rolling by with laughter and the endless expanse of the African savanna outside their windows. Eventually, the convoy of 3 vehicles reached their destination. This particular children's shelter was the largest of its kind in southwest Somalia. In fact, it was the heart of the entire settlement. The shelter came first, and the village grew around it. The scale was impressive by local standards. Still, the term village was generous. You could see from one end to the other standing at the entrance. The houses were scattered, barely forming streets, and urban planning was clearly not part of the equation. Brian frowned. The layout made him uneasy. Hard to defend, easy to ambush. The only saving grace was the wide, open terrain. Anyone approaching from outside would be spotted early. Their 3-vehicle convoy pulled through the shelter's main gate, though gate was a bit of a stretch. It looked more like an old-fashioned cattle fence from a pioneer ranch. Wooden beams, a makeshift latch. Easy enough to crash through in a vehicle. Not much of a barrier. That, at least, gave Brian some comfort. No rail security meant no real reason to break in. They parked the cars and stepped out. Instantly, a crowd of children greeted them in rows, clapping and singing in heavily accented English. Some of the younger ones looked lost, unsure of why they were there, glancing around curiously. Beside them stood several sturdy African women, clearly caretakers. Teachers, nurses, maybe both. Their smiles were genuine, nothing performative about it. Seeing the children's bright eyes and cheerful faces, Audrey Hepburn clasped her hands over her heart. "Henry," she said, her voice brimming with emotion, "just look at them. Aren't they precious?" The Hollywood legend stepped down from the car, graciously accepting a modest bouquet of wildflowers from a tiny girl's outstretched hands. She took the girl's hand, gently walking with her toward the others. Henry followed behind, raising his camera and snapping photos. Click, 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 capturing every angle. Brian's eyes followed the guide's vehicle, which had stopped some distance away. The overweight official came over to help translate for Audrey, but the muscular guide stayed back, huddled with a group of local men. They didn't approach the visitors, just stood there talking. Nothing overtly threatening in their behavior, but Brian took mental notes. Something didn't sit right. He assigned himself and Sam to unload the supplies bound for the shelter. Bernie and Mark stayed with the vehicles, guarding them. As the crates came out, the women, more matronly teachers than security, brightened at the sight. They pointed under a large shade tree, indicating where the supplies should be stacked for inventory. Brian didn't need to understand the language. Their gestures made everything clear. The supplies weren't going into the warehouse until they were officially logged. A solid rule, especially at a UN-backed facility. He was mildly disappointed he wouldn't get a look inside the actual shelter, but with the sun blazing and the air thick with heat, fewer steps sounded like a win. Still, something kept gnawing at him. The guide, the soldierly one, was still lingering near the outdoor stage on the shelter's tiny playground. He and his group of men had positioned themselves with a clear view of the guests. That wasn't normal. In every other site they'd visited, the local muscle usually disappeared the moment their job was done. Sometimes you had to go hunting for them before you could leave. And sure, sometimes they stuck around, but only if they'd been paid to do so, to make a show of presence and ward off any curious or dangerous elements from messing with the rich white visitors. But this felt different. Henry was still wandering around with his camera. While most of his shots focused on Audrey and the children, he'd also begun capturing wider angles of the shelter itself, his lens scanning the perimeter, the buildings, the people. Then he called out suddenly, voice bright but purposeful. "Mr. Mills." He jogged over, camera in hand. "Have you seen the bag where I put the extra rolls of film?" He popped open the back of the camera, rewinding the finished roll with a click of practiced fingers.